Hey there, friends. This is yours, Alex here. At the beginning, you'll hear heavy rain, symbolizing shared sadness. Don't worry, the storm will calm as the stories start. It may be difficult, but your support means a lot as we go through this together. Overwhelm feels like chaos without end, while stories provide structure with a clear beginning, middle, and end. Engaging with narratives helps fulfill our need for order, comforting the mind that even chaotic times can reach a resolution and balance. When time stresses, stories heal. If you are utterly exhausted but your brain refuses to cooperate, you are in the perfect, understanding company tonight. I know that exact, agonizing frustration. Tonight, let these gentle sounds and eerie stories act like a soothing balm to slow your racing heart rate down. Please like and subscribe if this brings you peace, and use the comments to share what's keeping you awake. Now, let us begin together. What the door remembered. In the dark, or almost dark, with something warm nearby and the rest of the night still ahead of you. Most horror lives in places that announce themselves. Abandoned buildings, remote roads, forests at the edge of maps. What this story is about is a different kind of horror. The kind that lives inside something ordinary. Inside a cheerful listing with good reviews and a 4.9 rating and photographs of a bright kitchen and a veranda with a cane chair and a view through the trees. The kind of horror that is possible only because of trust. Because you handed over your money and your location and your sense of safety to something you found on a website, and the website said it had been verified. This is the story of a woman named Nadia Callahan, a 36-year-old physiotherapist from Brisbane who booked a week in the Sunshine Coast hinterland after the end of a 5-year relationship, traveling alone with her border collie, Rue, because Rue was the one living thing she trusted completely, and the hinterland was 2 hours from Brisbane. And the listing said, "Dogs welcome," and the photographs of the veranda looked like somewhere you could breathe. Rue knew before Nadia did. Rue always knew. This is what Nadia told me. 3 months after she left the house, sitting in her kitchen in Brisbane with both hands around a mug of tea she did not drink, looking at the table surface the way people look at things when what they are actually looking at is behind their eyes. The key safe code was 4 digits, and the listing host had sent it in a message 2 days before arrival, along with a paragraph of instructions that had the cheerful efficiencies of someone who had written it many times and had learned, through repetition, which details guests most frequently failed to absorb. Park on the gravel beside the frangipani, not under the house. The drainage does funny things after rain, and the low side floods occasionally. The key safe is on the veranda post to the left of the front door, not the right. Rue is very welcome. The yard is fully fenced, and there is a dog bowl in the laundry. I have left milk, coffee, and a bottle of Shiraz on the kitchen bench. Make yourself at home. The host's name was listed on the platform as Genevieve M., and her profile photograph showed a woman in her 50s in a wide-brimmed hat in bright sunshine, smiling with the ease of someone who has been photographed outdoors often and knows how to receive light. Her reviews were consistent and numerous, 4 years of them, 342 reviews. Every one of them at least 4 stars. The most recent left 6 weeks ago by a couple from Melbourne who had written, "Perfect hinterland escape. The veranda is everything. Hosts are wonderful. Will absolutely return." Hosts, plural. Nadia noticed this in the car, on the drive up, phone propped on the passenger seat with the listing open while she drove the last section of the hinterland road, which was a sealed single lane through a tunnel of tall eucalypts that turned the late afternoon into a kind of filtered green dusk, the light coming through in shafts that moved across the bonnet as the trees moved. She noticed hosts, plural, and thought briefly that Genevieve M. had perhaps a partner whose name was not on the listing, And then the road curved and the house appeared at the top of a red dirt driveway. And she stopped thinking about the plural because the house was exactly what the photographs had promised, and the photographs had promised something she needed, which was a veranda and trees and the specific quality of stillness that belongs to elevated places above flat land. The Queenslander sat on high timber stumps, the way the old houses of this region were built to catch airflow and avoid the flood-prone soil. Its corrugated iron roof, the particular deep red of roofing iron, that has been through many wet seasons and has arrived at an accommodation with rust rather than a conflict with it. The louvered windows were open on the western face, and through them she could see the movement of a ceiling fan in the main room, its shadow rotating slowly on the ceiling in the last of the afternoon light. The frangipani beside the driveway was in full bloom, and the smell of it arrived through the car window before she had cut the engine. The particular sweetness of frangipani in humid heat, thick and almost edible. The smell of every Queensland summer she had ever spent in a place older than herself. Rue was standing on the back seat with her nose to the window gap, reading the air with the concentrated attention of a border collie, processing a new environment. Her body still, only the fine muscles around her nostrils moving. That invisible rapid-fire analysis of 1,000 simultaneous smells being sorted into categories with the efficiency of a system that has been doing this work since before the species had a name for it. Nadia watched her. Rue's tail was not moving. This was not alarming in itself. Rue held her tail still when she was concentrating, the same way some people go still when they are reading something that requires full attention. But the quality of the stillness was different from her reading something stillness. It was the quality of the stillness Rue used when she had identified something in the category of things that required caution rather than curiosity. And Nadia lived with Rue 6 years and could read the difference between those two. Stillness is the way you read the difference between a friend saying, "Everything is fine," in a tone that means it is fine and a tone that means it is not fine at all. She got out of the car. The gravel was warm through her sandals, still holding the heat of the afternoon, and the air was that specific Queensland hinterland air, eucalyptus and red soil and the green smell of things that grow fast in wet heat, layered under the frangipani, and underneath all of it something she registered as damp timber. The particular smell of old wood that has been breathing moisture for a long time. She went to the key safe. The code worked on the first attempt, and the key was a standard house key on a ring, with a smaller key she did not recognize. Not a padlock key, too flat for that. The kind of small key that belongs to an interior lock, a cupboard, perhaps, or a drawer. The kind of secondary key included on a ring as a practical afterthought. She did not think about the smaller key. She went up the veranda steps, 8 of them, timber, painted the heritage gray that Queenslander houses wore in a certain period of renovation, and through the front door, which was a double-door arrangement, with louvered timber panels above and glass panels below, and the house opened around her in the way of old Queenslander houses, which is to say, opened with an immediate and comprehensive generosity, the central corridor running straight through from front to back with every room opening off it, the whole house a single gesture of cross-ventilation, everything arranged around the movement of air. The kitchen was at the back, and the Shiraz and the milk were on the bench as promised, and the dog bowl was in the laundry beyond the kitchen. A generous red ceramic bowl with Genevieve's dogs or previous guest dogs or something's residue of dried watermarks around its interior lip. Nadia filled it from the laundry tap. In the laundry, while the bowl was filling, she noticed the door. It was in the laundry's external wall. Not the external wall that faced the yard, the side wall, which she understood from the house's orientation faced north, which meant it opened toward the high-set space beneath the house. The stumped undercroft that in old Queenslanders was sometimes enclosed and used for storage, and sometimes left open to the air, and sometimes converted into a second dwelling, and sometimes simply left as a dim timber-framed space that accumulated the overflow of whatever the house above it contained. The door was timber, painted white, the same as the laundry walls, fitted with a standard interior handle, and below the handle, a keyhole of the variety that belonged to the small flat key on the ring. It was not mentioned in the listing. It was not visible in any of the listing photographs, which she would check later on her phone, and which had been taken with the particular angle and framing of photographs taken by someone who knows which elements of a space to include and which to allow to fall outside the frame. Rue came to the laundry doorway. She stopped at the threshold. The bowl was still filling, the sound of the tap running, and Rue stood at the laundry doorway with her body in the posture that Nadia would later describe, sitting in her Brisbane kitchen with the untouched tea in her hands, as the posture of a dog who has decided she will not be entering this room, and has decided this with a completeness and a finality that Nadia had never seen in her, because Rue was a border collie, and border collies did not decide things with finality. They decided things provisionally, pending new information, with the intellectual flexibility of a dog that understood the value of updating its assessment. This was not provisional. Nadia turned off the tap and carried the bowl to the doorway and set it on the kitchen side of the threshold, and Rue dropped her head and drank from it, without taking her eyes off the laundry door, which was the white-painted internal wall door that led to the undercroft beneath the house. Nadia looked at the door. The house was cooling now as the sun went down. The louvered windows doing their work, the ceiling fan in the main room moving the air through the corridor in a slow current that she could feel at the back of her neck. The frangipani smell was coming through from outside, and the eucalyptus was stronger now in the evening air, and the specific smell of the old timber of the house was present in the way that old timber is always present in the background of a Queenslander. Not unpleasant, not alarming, simply the smell of wood that has been doing the structural work of a house for many decades, and has absorbed the accumulated weather and heat and breath of everyone who has ever lived inside it. Beneath those smells, from the direction of the white door, something that she would spend the rest of the week trying to name and would eventually describe, in the way that people describe smells when the language is insufficient, as the smell of a room that has not been opened in a long time. And beneath that, fainter, the smell of something that was almost human, not unclean, not decomposition, nothing as dramatic as that. Simply the warm animal smell of a living thing in an enclosed space, the way a room smells when someone has been sleeping in it. She told herself it was the drainage. The host's message had said the drainage did funny things after rain, and it had rained 3 days ago, according to the forecast she had checked on the drive up, and drainage beneath an old Queenslander would smell of exactly this: damp earth and timber, and the accumulated moisture of a wet season, with whatever organic layering the soil beneath an old house developed across decades of wet seasons and dry seasons, and the slow composting of whatever fell through the stumped floor above. She carried Rue's bowl back to the laundry and set it inside the door without crossing the threshold herself, which she noticed without wanting to notice. She unpacked. She opened the Shiraz and poured a glass and took it to the veranda, and the view through the trees was what she had come for. The long fall of the hinterland toward the coast, the last orange light on the tree canopy, the specific quality of elevated stillness, and Rue came and pressed against her leg, and Nadia put her hand on Rue's back and felt the dog's warmth and the slight tension in her muscles, which was not the relaxed evening tension of a dog settling into a new space, but the maintained readiness of a dog that had not yet decided the space was safe. Below them, the undercroft beneath the house was dim in the last light, its stumped space open on 3 sides and closed on the north by the external wall of the laundry and the white-painted door she had found inside it. She could see the door's exterior from here, a section of fibrous cement sheeting set in a timber frame, painted the same heritage gray as the house's exterior, with a small vent Louvre at its base of the kind that provided airflow to an enclosed space. The Louvre was moving. Not in the wind, she checked, and the frangipani branches were still, and the leaves of the nearest eucalypt were still, and there was no wind in the evening air. The Louvre blades were moving slowly, one after another, in the sequential way that Louvre blades move when air is being pushed through them from inside, the way you push air from inside a room when you breathe. She watched the Louvre for a long time. Then she took her wine inside, and she checked the listing again on her phone, and she found Genevieve M's contact number in the message thread, and she looked at it, and she did not call. Not that night. She told herself that the Louvre was a pressure thing, that enclosed spaces beneath old houses operated like bellows in the evening cool, the air contracting as the temperature dropped and pushing through whatever vents were available. And this was a plausible explanation, and she had come to the hinterland to breathe and not to be afraid of Louvres moving in the evening, under an old Queenslander house on the Sunshine Coast. She made dinner and ate it on the veranda and watched the stars come out, and Rue lay beside the cane chair with her head on her paws and her eyes open, and below them the undercroft went dark, and the Louvre blades were still now, or still enough, and the frangipani smell was softer in the evening cool, and the eucalyptus was dominant, and the night sounds of the hinterland, the insects, the distant creak, the occasional settling creak of an old timber house releasing the day's heat, were what they were supposed to be. Ordinary, entirely ordinary. She told herself this until she believed the surface of it, and then she went inside and locked the front door with the key. And she looked at the smaller key on the ring, and she put the key ring on the kitchen bench, and she did not use the smaller key, and she went to bed. In the dark, at some time in the middle of the night that she did not check, Rue got off the bed. This was not unusual. Rue moved at night, to drink, to settle in a cooler spot on the floor, to conduct the small domestic relocations of a dog who understood the house as a shared space and exercised her portion of it at her own discretion. What woke Nadia was not Rue leaving the bed. It was the sound of Rue's claws on the timber floor, moving down the corridor toward the kitchen, and then stopping and not moving again for a very long time, and the quality of the not moving, the specific weighted silence of a dog standing absolutely still in the dark in the direction of the laundry, was the sound that brought Nadia fully awake at whatever hour it was, in a house she had been in for 6 hours, in the hinterland alone. She lay in the dark and she listened to Rue not moving, and from the direction of the laundry, faint and entirely unmistakable, through the white-painted door and the fibrous cement sheeting, and the heritage gray exterior wall, and the small vent Louvre at the base of it, the sound of something beneath the house shifting its weight. Not the house settling, not the drainage. The deliberate, careful, weight-transferring sound of something that has been still for a long time, and is now, in the dark and the quiet and the deep hinterland night, choosing not to be still anymore. Rue did not move from her position in the corridor for the remainder of the night, and when the morning came she was still there, facing the laundry, and what Nadia saw in her dog's face in the early light was not fear. It was the expression of an animal that has been standing guard, which is a different thing entirely, and which is in some ways worse. Nadia did not go to the laundry first thing in the morning. She went to the kettle, and she filled it at the kitchen tap, and she stood with her back deliberately angled away from the laundry doorway, in the particular way of someone who has decided that the angle of her body constitutes a position rather than an avoidance. The way you stand in a room when you know something is behind you and you have chosen, for the duration of the kettle boiling, not to acknowledge it. The morning light was coming through the eastern Louvres in long parallel bars, warm and specific, landing on the kitchen bench in a pattern that moved slowly as the sun moved, and the frangipani was present again in the morning air, and the creak sound was clearer in the quiet before the day's heat built, and everything about the hinterland morning was doing its level best to be what hinterland mornings were supposed to be, which was restorative. Rue was at the back door, not the laundry, the back door of the kitchen, which opened onto a small timber landing, and then steps down to the fenced yard, and Rue was standing at it with the posture of a dog who requires the yard, and is making this requirement known through the dignified medium of proximity and pointed attention rather than sound, because Rue did not whine, had never whined, considered whining a form of communication beneath the complexity of what she had to express. Nadia opened the back door. Rue went down the steps and into the yard and did not go near the undercroft side of the fence, which ran along the northern edge of the property and separated the yard from the driveway and the frangipani and the section of the house's exterior that contained the fibrous cement wall and the heritage gray Louvre vent. She did her business on the southern lawn and came back to the steps and sat and waited. Nadia took this in. The coffee was ready, and she took it to the veranda and sat in the cane chair and looked at the view, which was still what it had been the previous evening. The long fall of the hinterland, the tree canopy, the suggestion of the coast as a brightness at the horizon, and she held the mug in both hands and she thought about the weight-shifting sound from the previous night in the way that you think about something in daylight that frightened you in the dark, which is to say, with the determined reasonableness of a person who has decided that reasonableness is the correct response and is applying it with perhaps slightly more effort than genuine reasonableness requires. Old houses, she told herself, made sounds. Queenslanders in particular made sounds. The contraction and expansion of timber in the diurnal cycle of heat and cool, the movement of stumps in reactive soil, the particular complaints of corrugated iron roofing, which had strong opinions about temperature change and expressed them throughout the night in a percussive vocabulary of ticks and groans and occasional sharp reports that could wake you from a deep sleep and take 3 seconds to identify as the roof rather than as something requiring immediate action. The sound she had heard had not been the roof. She knew the sound she had heard had not been the roof in the same way she knew when she placed her hand flat on a patient's lumbar and felt the quality of resistance there, whether the resistance was muscular or structural, not from any single piece of information, but from the accumulated understanding of a body that had been doing a particular kind of reading for long enough that the reading had become instinctive rather than analytical, something the hands knew before the mind had assembled its reasoning. The sound had been weight shifting. She drank her coffee and looked at the view. At 9 in the morning, she opened the listing on her phone and read every review, all 342 of them, from the most recent backward, which was a thing she should have done before booking and had not done, because the aggregate rating was 4.9, and she had been tired, and the photographs of the veranda had looked like somewhere she could breathe. The reviews were, as a body of text, consistent and warm and specific in the way of genuine reviews rather than manufactured ones. People mentioned particular things, the specific quality of the mattress, the brand of coffee left on the bench, a bird they had seen from the veranda at a particular time of morning, the way the afternoon light came through the eastern Louvres and moved across the kitchen floor. These were the details of people who had been genuinely present in the house and had genuinely registered its qualities. None of them mentioned the laundry door. None of them mentioned the undercroft. None of them mentioned sounds at night, or their dog's behavior, or a key on the key ring, for which no corresponding lock was identified in any of the listing information. One review from 14 months ago, posted by a woman whose profile listed her location as Toowoomba, said only, "A beautiful property in a stunning location. We enjoyed our stay, though the hinterland is perhaps not for everyone." She had given it 3 stars, which in the context of the surrounding 4- and 5-star reviews was an anomaly significant enough that Nadia sat with it, turning it over the way you turn over a sentence that is doing more work than its surface suggests. The hinterland is perhaps not for everyone. Nadia typed a message to Genevieve M. She typed, "Good morning, we arrived safely last night. Thank you for the beautiful house. One quick question. The key ring has a small flat key that I have not been able to match to any lock in the house. Could you tell me what it opens?" She read it back. She deleted the last sentence and replaced it with, "There is also a door in the laundry that I think may lead to the underhouse storage. Is there anything down there I should know about, or is it simply off limits?" She read that back. She deleted and replaced it again. "I found a door in the laundry. Is the space beneath the house accessible to guests, or is it a private storage area?" She sent this version. She watched the message show as delivered. She watched it for 6 minutes, during which time Genevieve M. was presumably doing whatever Genevieve M. did on a Tuesday morning, which was nothing that precluded checking her messages and responding to a guest query of the kind that any reasonable host would understand required a prompt reply. The message did not become read. Nadia put her phone face down on the cane armrest and looked at the trees. And Rue came and pressed against her calf, and she put her hand on the dog's back and felt the warmth of her and the slight, maintained tension that had not left since the previous evening. She spent the morning doing what she had come to do, which was to walk. The hinterland track that began at the property's rear gate was marked on the listings information sheet as a 3-kilometer loop through state forest, returning along the ridge line with views suitable for dogs on lead. She put Rue on the lead and went through the gate and into the trees, and the track was what the information sheet had described. Red soil, compacted and clear, running through tall eucalyptus with a mid-story of wattles, still holding the last of their yellow. The air inside the trees different from the air at the house, cooler and greener and complex with the layered biology of a forest, doing its continuous invisible work. Rue walked at her side with focused attention, ears moving, reading the forest the way she read everything, thoroughly and without conclusion, keeping her assessments provisional the way she did in environments she had determined were safe. The walk was good. The walk was what she had needed, and she stayed in it. And she let the red soil and the eucalyptus and the effort of the ridge climb occupy her body and her attention completely. And by the time the track brought her back along the ridge line, with the coast as a distant brightness below the tree line, she had been walking for 90 minutes, and the sound from the previous night had receded to the part of her mind where things are stored that you have decided to assess later, when you have more information. The gate at the rear of the property brought her back into the yard. Rue stopped at the gate, not dramatically. She did not balk or plant her feet or produce any of the behaviors of a dog in visible distress. She simply stopped, with the gate open and the yard in front of her, and she looked across the yard toward the northern fence line, which was the fence line nearest the undercroft and the heritage gray exterior wall of the laundry, with its vent Louvre at the base. Then she looked up at Nadia with the look she used when she needed Nadia to understand something she could not say. Nadia looked at the fence line. The Louvre vent was closed. All the blades were closed, angled down in their resting position, which was how Louvre vents sat when no air pressure was moving through them, which was how they should have been sitting, which was how they had been sitting this morning, when she had gone in the opposite direction to get her coffee. She was almost certain they had been open when she left for the walk. Not certain enough to act on. Certain in the way of something registered peripherally at the edge of a moment when your attention was elsewhere. The kind of not quite certainty that is frustratingly insufficient as evidence and absolutely sufficient as feeling. She went inside. The message to Genevieve M. was still showing as delivered and unread. She checked the time, 11:43, and she thought about the 342 reviews and the 4.9 rating and the cheerful efficiency of the arrival instructions and the Shiraz on the bench and the dog bowl in the laundry. And she thought about hosts, plural, which the Melbourne couple had written in a review 6 weeks ago. And she thought about what it means for a listing to be managed by more than one person, and whether the person who was not Genevieve M. was the person who knew about the door in the laundry, and had simply not been the one to send the arrival instructions. She looked at the small flat key on the ring. It was sitting on the kitchen bench where she had left it, beside the Shiraz which she had recorked last night after a single glass, and it was an entirely ordinary key, the kind sold in hardware stores in strips of 4 for a few dollars, the kind that belongs to cheap interior locks installed for privacy rather than security, the kind whose teeth were minimal because the locks they operated were minimal, because the locks they operated were interior locks, inside locks, locks on things that were meant to be accessed by the person who lived in the house, rather than kept from them. She picked it up. She held it. She went to the laundry doorway and stood in it, and the laundry was exactly as she had last seen it. The washing machine against the wall, the shelf above it with the previous guest's forgotten bottle of fabric softener and a spare toilet roll, the red ceramic dog bowl on the floor near the external door, the white painted internal wall door with its standard handle and the keyhole below the handle. She crossed the laundry floor. She put the key in the lock. It fit. She did not turn it. She stood with the key in the lock and her hand on the key, and she listened, and the house was quiet around her, and the eucalyptus came through the open Louvres, and Rue was in the kitchen doorway behind her. She could hear the sound of Rue's breathing, which was audible in the silence, and which had the careful, measured quality of a breath being taken by a dog who is maintaining her position by an act of will rather than by ease. From the other side of the white door, nothing. From the other side of the white door, the specific quality of nothing that is produced by a space in which something has recently been still, and the stillness is so practiced and so complete that it is indistinguishable from the nothing of genuine emptiness, except that genuine emptiness does not produce the warmth she could feel at the door's edge, where the painted timber met the painted frame, where the gap between door and frame was thin enough to be invisible, and yet wide enough for warmth to move through it, a gentle and consistent warmth that had no relationship to the morning temperature outside, and no relationship to anything the house's plumbing or structure could account for. A warmth that was the temperature of a living body in a confined space. She took the key out of the lock. She took her hand off the door. She went back to the kitchen, and she picked up her phone. And she called the number in the message thread. Not the message function, the actual call function. And it rang 4 times and went to voicemail. And Genevieve M.'s voicemail was a brief, warm, professional recording that told her she had reached Genevieve's phone and to leave a message and she would get back to her shortly. She left a message. She said, "Genevieve, this is Nadia Callahan staying at the property this week. I have sent you a message as well. I have a question about the door in the laundry and the space beneath the house. I would appreciate a call back when you have a moment. Thank you." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen with her phone in her hand and Rue at her feet, and the morning going on around her in all its ordinary warm directions. And she thought about the warmth at the door's edge, And she thought about the reviews and the things none of them had mentioned. And she thought about a Toowoomba woman who had given 3 stars and written that the hinterland was perhaps not for everyone. And she thought about the listing's host description, which she now read for the first time with the attention it deserved, and which said, "Genevieve and family have been welcoming guests to this beautiful Queenslander since 2019. We love this property and we love sharing it. Make yourself at home, as we do, we and family, and as we do. Not as former residents, not as owners who lived elsewhere, as we do, present tense, the tense of current occupation, the tense of people who were still doing the thing the sentence described." She read it 3 more times. She looked at the laundry doorway from across the kitchen, and the laundry was bright in the mid-morning light, and the white door at the far end of it was white and closed and entirely still, and the key ring was on the bench beside her with the small flat key and the house key together on the ring, and outside the frangipani was doing its generous, overwhelming work in the warming air, and somewhere below the floorboards, in the stumped and enclosed undercroft beneath this beautiful Queenslander, in the space that opened off the laundry through a door that had not appeared in any of the listing photographs, something was being very quiet, with the specific, practiced quality of something that had learned, across a great deal of time, exactly how quiet it needed to be. The message showed as read at 11:59, and Genevieve M. did not call back, and did not reply to the message, and at 12:01 a new message arrived in the thread that said only, "So glad you arrived safely. Enjoy your stay, and let me know if you need anything at all," which was the message of someone who had read a question and decided, with full knowledge of its contents, not to answer it. Nadia called the platform at 12:30. Not Genevieve, the platform itself, the number listed under the help section of the app, under the heading Guest Safety Concerns, which was a heading she had navigated to with the particular focused efficiency of someone who has decided that the social cost of making a fuss is lower than the alternative, and is moving quickly before the decision reverses itself. The hold music was the kind of hold music designed by people who understand that the person listening to it is already agitated, and who have therefore chosen something so relentlessly neutral that it functions less as music and more as an auditory version of a beige wall. And Nadia stood on the veranda with the phone to her ear and looked at the view and breathed through her nose and waited. The operator who answered was named Priya, and she was professional and warm in the specifically calibrated way of people trained to receive complaints that range from the trivial to the genuinely serious without being able to predict which category the current call occupies until well into the conversation. Nadia said, "I am staying in a property on the Sunshine Coast hinterland, booked through your platform." The listing describes the property as managed by the host and family. I have found a locked door on the interior of the property that leads to an enclosed space beneath the house. The door is not mentioned anywhere in the listing. When I contacted the host to ask about it, she read my message and sent a response that did not address my question. I would like to know whether the space beneath the house is disclosed in the property information held by your platform, and whether the host is currently resident at the property. Priya said, "Thank you for contacting us. I completely understand your concern, and I want to make sure we get this sorted for you today. Can I take your booking reference?" Nadia gave it. Priya said, "And you mentioned a locked door. Are you feeling unsafe in the property at this time?" Nadia considered this question with the honesty it deserved. She said, "I am not certain. I heard sounds from the space beneath the house last night that I was not able to explain. I have found that the key provided with the property key opens the lock on the door to that space. I have not opened the door. My dog has been unwilling to enter the laundry, which is the room containing the door, since we arrived." There was a brief pause in which Nadia could hear, beneath the hold music that had been faded down but not eliminated, the sound of Priya typing. Priya said, "I can see the property's listing information here. The description does indicate that the property is a high-set Queenslander with underhouse storage, and notes that the storage area is for host use only and not accessible to guests. This information is in the property details section rather than in the main listing description, which I understand may not have been immediately visible to you when booking," Nadia said. "It is not mentioned in the main listing, in the house rules, or in any communication I received from the host. The key to the door was included on my key ring without explanation." Priya said, "I understand, and that does seem like an oversight on the host's part in terms of communication. I am going to flag this booking for review, and I would encourage you, if at any point you feel your safety may be compromised, to contact local police and then reach out to us immediately. We can arrange alternative accommodation if," Nadia said, "is the host listed as resident at the property?" Priya was quiet for a moment. She said, "The listing category for this property is an entire home listing, which indicates the guest has exclusive use of the property during their stay. I can see that the host profile indicates the host is local to the area." Nadia said, "Local to the area is not the same as not resident at the property." Priya said, "No, it is not." She said it without the calibrated warmth, without the professional register, in the flat and honest tone of someone who has just acknowledged something that the platform structure had not been designed to accommodate gracefully. And the flatness and honesty of it was more alarming than anything she could have said in her professional voice, because it confirmed that the question Nadia had asked was a question worth asking, rather than a question produced by an overactive imagination in an unfamiliar house. Nadia thanked her and ended the call. She sat in the cane chair, and Rue put her head on Nadia's knee, and Nadia put her hand on Rue's head, and they sat together in the veranda's warmth, and she looked at the view through the trees and thought about the word local, and what local meant for a host who described the property in the present tense as the place where they lived, and what local meant in the context of a house whose enclosed undercroft was warm at a temperature that had no structural explanation. She thought about going home. She thought about it specifically and practically. The drive back to Brisbane was 2 hours, and she had taken the full week off work, and the flat she had left in Brisbane was the flat she had shared with Daniel for 5 years, which was now the flat she shared with Rue, and with the particular quality of emptiness that follows the departure of a person who has been in a space long enough that the space has organized itself around their presence, and whose departure leaves a kind of negative impression, the shape of the person in the arrangement of the furniture, and the contents of the refrigerator, and the coffee cup that was not her preferred side of the dish rack. She had come here to not be in that flat, she thought. I will go and look at the undercroft from the outside, not open the door, not use the key. Simply walk around the exterior of the house and look at the enclosed space beneath it from the outside, in the full light of a Tuesday midday, with Rue on the lead and the rational mind in the ascendant and the frangipani doing its ordinary generous thing in the warm air, and assess what she saw with the same professional detachment she brought to a clinical assessment, without the overlay of a sleepless early morning and the suggestive grammar of an unanswered message. She put Rue on the lead. They went down the veranda steps and around the northern side of the house, along the gravel driveway, past the frangipani, to the exterior face of the laundry wall. The heritage gray fibrous cement sheeting was exactly what it was, a fibrous cement panel, sealed, painted, fitted into a timber frame between the house stumps, solid and unremarkable. The vent Louvre at its base was at ankle height, its blades horizontal and closed. The frame of the door was visible as a faint rectangular seam in the cement sheeting. The panel that was the door slightly more regular in its surface texture than the surrounding fixed panels. the way a door reveals itself when you know to look for it. She crouched and looked at the vent Louvre. The blades were closed. She put her face close to the Louvre, and she looked through the gaps between the blades. Inside was dark, and the darkness was the specific darkness of an enclosed space that receives no natural light, not the variable dark of a room with its curtains drawn, through which shapes eventually become legible as the eyes adjust, but the absolute dark of a space sealed from daylight so completely that adjustment was not going to help. The dark of something built to be dark. She could see nothing. She could feel, against her face at the Louvre's gap, a warmth that had no relationship to the ambient temperature outside. And she could smell, directly, without the mediation of doors and walls and the filtering effect of the laundry's own smell. The smell she had registered the previous evening when she filled the dog bowl, which was the smell she had been calling old timber and drainage, and which she now crouched at the Louvre in the midday light, with her face 6 inches from the vent, could not call that anymore, because old timber and drainage did not smell of instant coffee. Faint, not fresh, not the smell of coffee recently made, but the specific residual smell of instant coffee in an enclosed space, the way a room smells hours after a jar of it has been opened, the coffee smell that becomes part of the air rather than a discrete scent, the coffee smell of a space where someone has been making and drinking instant coffee with enough regularity that the smell has become structural. She stood up. She stepped back from the wall. Rue was at the end of the lead with her body oriented away from the wall, facing the driveway. Her posture, the posture of a dog who has confirmed what she already knew and is now ready to leave the vicinity of the confirmation. Nadia walked back around to the veranda steps. She went inside. She went directly to the laundry, and she stood in front of the white door, and she took her phone out of her pocket, and she opened the torch function, and she looked at the gap between the door and the frame along its full length, top and bottom and both sides. At the bottom, in the gap between the door's base and the laundry floor, a thin strip of darkness. No light from beneath. She had not expected light. The interior had no windows. She had seen that from the Louvre. But in the beam of her torch, moving slowly along the bottom gap, something at the far left corner of the gap, where the door met the frame's base in the corner of the laundry wall, a mark. She crouched. She brought the torch close. The mark was on the laundry floor, just inside the door's sweep arc, the arc of worn linoleum where the door had been opened and closed many times, a quarter circle of slightly paler linoleum where the door's base had repeatedly contacted the floor, the way every door leaves its arc on the floor beneath it across years of use. The arc was on the laundry side of the door, not the undercroft side, the laundry side. The door had been opened from below, from the undercroft, many times, many enough times, across enough time, that the arc of its movement was worn into the linoleum, which meant the door opened outward into the laundry, which meant it was not a storage access door for the host to retrieve items stored below. A storage access door opened inward, into the storage. You stepped through it and down, into the space below. The door opened away from you, into the space you were entering. This door opened toward you, out of the space below, into the laundry. It was not designed to let people into the undercroft. It was designed to let something out of it. She stood up. She looked at the key ring on the kitchen bench, which she could see through the laundry doorway, and she thought about what kind of lock was installed on a door designed to open outward from a dark enclosed space, and she understood that the lock whose key she held was on the laundry side of the door, which meant the lock kept the door closed from the laundry side, which meant the thing the lock was doing was keeping whatever was in the undercroft rather than keeping unauthorized people out of it. She picked up the key ring. She looked at the small flat key. She thought about the instant coffee smell and the warmth at the door's edge, and the Louvre blades moving in still air, and the weight-shifting sound at whatever hour of the night it had been, and Rue in the corridor until morning, and Rue at the yard gate assessing the fence line, and Rue's head on her knee with the steady, vigilant quality of a dog who has appointed herself to a function. She put the key ring in her pocket. She went to the bedroom, and she opened her bag, which she had unpacked only partially the previous evening, and she began putting things back into it with the organized efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is not going to unmake it by slowing down, because slowing down allows the rational mind to reassemble its case for reasonableness, and she did not want the rational mind's case right now. She wanted the bag packed and Rue's bowls rinsed and the car loaded and herself in it with the seatbelt on and the gravel of the driveway under the tires. She had the bag on her shoulder and Rue's lead in her hand, and she was in the kitchen doorway when her phone rang. Genevieve M. She looked at the name on the screen. She answered. The voice on the other end was not the warm and professionally cheerful voice of the host profile's implicit promise, not the voice of the woman in the wide-brimmed hat in the bright sunshine who knew how to receive light. It was a voice that was careful in the way that voices are careful when the person speaking them has been informed that a guest has called the platform and has chosen, in response to this information, to call rather than continue to not respond. Genevieve said, "Nadia, I am so sorry I missed your message earlier. It has been a busy morning. I understand you had a question about the property." Nadia said, "Yes. I want to know who is living in the space beneath the house." The silence that followed was not the silence of a person who did not understand the question. It was the silence of a person who had been hoping across some interval of optimism that the question would not be asked in exactly these terms, and who was now faced with the terms and was deciding how to respond to them. Genevieve said, "The underhouse area is a private storage space for family use. It is noted in the property details as off-limits to guests." Nadia said, "I am not asking what the listing says about it. I am asking who is living in it. The door opens outward from the inside. There is a warm temperature in the enclosed space inconsistent with the ambient temperature. I can smell instant coffee through the vent Louvre. My dog has been monitoring the door since we arrived." Another silence. Genevieve said, "My son uses the space occasionally." She said it the way people say things they have been withholding, with the specific flatness of a sentence that has had all its energy removed by the length of time it has been held back. Nadia said, "Your son is living under the house," Genevieve said. "He is going through a difficult time. He is not a danger to anyone. He has his own entrance from the exterior. He does not come into the main house while guests are present, and he has never," Nadia said. "There is one entrance to that space. The door in the laundry. I have been here since last night. The exterior panel is sealed cement sheeting. There is no external entrance." The silence this time was different from the previous ones. It was longer, and in it, from the direction of the laundry, through the kitchen, through the white door, and the fibrous cement, and the vent Louvre, and whatever the undercroft space contained, Nadia heard, clear and entirely unmistakable in the quiet house, in the held air of a hinterland noon, the sound of a kettle beginning to boil. She walked out of the house. She went down the veranda steps, and she did not look at the undercroft wall, and she opened the car, and she put the bag in, and she put Rue in the back seat, and she got in the front, and she started the engine, and the gravel of the driveway was loud under the tires as she reversed toward the road. At the end of the driveway, she stopped. She looked at the house in the rearview mirror. The house looked exactly like its photographs. The corrugated iron roof, the heritage gray exterior, the frangipani, the veranda with the cane chair, the louvered windows open on the western face, and the ceiling fan's shadow rotating slowly on the ceiling beyond them. Below the veranda, in the dim of the undercroft between the timber stumps, the fibrous cement wall with its vent Louvre, and the Louvre blades were open, all of them, angled upward in the position of blades through which air is being pushed from inside. And in the gap between the blades, the darkness beyond them was total and absolute. And there was no movement in the darkness, and no shape, and nothing she could point to and say with any certainty was a face. But the Louvre blades were open, and something inside the darkness was breathing out. She pulled onto the road and she drove away from the property through the eucalyptus tunnel, and she did not look in the mirror again. Rue put her chin on Nadia's shoulder from the back seat, the warm weight of her jaw against the side of Nadia's neck, the specific and uncomplicated comfort of an animal whose function is to be present. And Nadia drove, and the hinterland road straightened, and the trees gave way to the cleared land of the plateau, and the brightness of the midday sky opened above the car, and the coast appeared as a line on the horizon, and she breathed, once completely, from the bottom of her lungs outward. Her hands on the wheel were steady. She noted this, and was not certain whether it meant she was all right or whether it meant the steadiness was the steadiness that comes after, the steadiness of a body that has finished its emergency and is now simply driving, simply doing the next available thing, which was to be on this road and not on that property, and to have Rue's chin on her shoulder, and to be going in the direction of away. She had left the key ring on the kitchen bench, both keys. She thought about the small flat key on the bench in that kitchen, and about what it meant that the lock it belonged to locked from the laundry side rather than from the undercroft side. And she thought about Genevieve M. and her family and her son who was going through a difficult time. And she thought about 342 reviews and a 4.9 rating and a listing that had been active for 4 years. And a Melbourne couple who had written that the hosts were wonderful. She thought about the Toowoomba woman who had given 3 stars. She thought about the hinterland is perhaps not for everyone. And she understood, driving away from it in the midday light, that the sentence had not been a comment on the landscape. The platform issued a full refund 4 days later, citing an undisclosed occupant on the premises, and the listing was suspended pending review, and Genevieve M.'s profile photograph of the woman in the wide-brimmed hat in the bright sunshine disappeared from the platform entirely, and the 342 reviews went with it, and the only record that any of it had existed was the Toowoomba woman's 3 stars, which had been hosted on a different part of the platform's architecture, and which persisted for several weeks before it too was gone. Nadia did not go straight back to Brisbane. She drove the hinterland road to the plateau's edge, and then pulled into a servo on the edge of the small town of Mapleton, a single street place with a bakery and a hardware store, and the kind of general store that sells everything from sunscreen to fence wire. And she sat in the car park with the engine running, and the air conditioning doing its work, and Rue in the back seat with her chin now on the center console between the front seats, which was Rue's preferred position for serious proximity, the position she adopted when she had assessed that Nadia required a specific and sustained closeness rather than the general companionship of simply being in the same vehicle. Nadia bought a meat pie from the bakery and ate it in the car. She did not taste it particularly, but the eating of it was an act with a shape and a beginning and a middle and an end, and she needed that. She needed the simple architecture of a task, and the pie provided it. She fed Rue the last quarter, which she always did with meat pies, and which Rue always accepted as though the offering were a surprise, rather than the established conclusion of a ritual they had performed, perhaps 200 times. Then she sat with her hands in her lap and she thought. What she thought about first was practical, because practical was where she went when she was frightened, and needed to convert the fright into something actionable, which was a habit she had developed across 11 years of clinical practice, in which the appropriate response to a difficult finding was never panic, but always the next necessary step. She thought about where she would stay tonight, whether she would drive the 2 hours back to Brisbane and sleep in the flat with its Daniel-shaped negative impression, or whether she would find something here on the coast, something reviewed and straightforward and fully photographed with no undercroft and no secondary keys on the ring. She thought about the platform's chat function and the calls she had made to Priya and the suspension she had been told would be initiated, and whether the suspension meant that Genevieve M. had been notified, and whether the notification had reached the son, and what the son had done in response to the notification, and whether he was still in the undercroft, or whether Genevieve M. had called him and told him to leave, and whether leave in the context of a man living in the space beneath a rental property on the Sunshine Coast hinterland was a thing that happened quickly or slowly, or at all. She thought about the reviews, and the 4 years of them, and the 342 people who had stayed in that house and left with nothing more than the general warmth of a positive hinterland experience to show for it. She thought, had none of them heard anything? She thought, or had some of them heard and chosen not to include it in a review, because including it would have required them to describe something that the review field was not structured to contain, and because the drive home had perhaps resolved it into the category of things that were probably explainable and not worth the social effort of making a fuss about. She thought about the Toowoomba woman. She opened her phone, and she went to the platform, and she searched for the listing and found, as she had half expected, that the listing was already down, not suspended with a notice, simply absent, the URL resolving to an error page with the platform's generic apologetic message about content that was no longer available. The 3-star review was gone with it. She sat with this for a moment. Then she opened the app's messaging function, and she found her conversation thread with Genevieve M. And she took a screenshot of the full conversation, including her own unanswered question and Genevieve's non-responsive reply, and she saved it to her camera roll, and she sat with her thumb over the thread for a moment before she typed one more message into it. She typed, "I want you to know that I am aware the door opens outward. I am aware of what that means about the purpose of the lock. I have reported this to the platform, and I intend to report it to the Queensland Police Service. If your son requires support, that is something I have genuine sympathy for, but the way this situation has been managed is not acceptable, and what has been done to the guests who stayed in that property is not acceptable. I hope he gets what he needs." She sent it. She did not wait to see if it was read. She called the Maroochydore police station, whose number she found through a search, and she explained the situation to the officer, who answered, whose name was Constable Webb, and who listened to the account with the quality of attention of someone who is hearing something that falls outside the usual categories of his day's work, and is deciding, while listening, which of the available categories it most closely approximates. He said, "To confirm, you are saying there was a person living in the enclosed space beneath the property without disclosure to guests?" She said, "Yes, a family member of the host. I could hear him. I could smell evidence of occupation, and the door from the interior of the property to the space was lockable only from the guest side, which meant he was in the space during my stay without my knowledge and without the ability to leave through that door during my stay unless I unlocked it for him," Constable Webb said. "And you have since left the property," she said. "I am in Mapleton," he said. "Right, I am going to take your details and flag this for the local area command. Can I ask, did you feel at any point that you were in immediate danger?" She considered this. She said, "I do not know what I was in. I know I was in a situation that was not what I had agreed to be in, and I know that the situation was known to the host and managed in a way that prioritized the concealment of it over the safety of guests. whether the concealment was because the sun was dangerous or because the sun was not dangerous, but the situation was embarrassing, I do not know. What I know is that I slept in that house with something I had not been told about in the space directly below me. And the door between us was locked with a key that was on my key ring, and I did not know what had opened until the second morning. Constable Webb said, "Right. I appreciate that, and I want you to know we will follow this up. Can I take your full name and contact number?" She gave them. He said, "Are you all right to drive?" She said yes. He said, "Take care of yourself." She ended the call and put the phone on the passenger seat and looked through the windscreen at the Mapleton Main Street, which was going about its midday business with the unhurried pace of a small Queensland town on a Tuesday, a woman with a pram coming out of the general store. Two utes parked nose-in outside the hardware store, a blue heeler on the tray of one of them lying in the full sun with the absolute contentment of a dog who has found the warm spot and sees no reason to reconsider it. She thought about the blue heeler on the ute tray. She thought about Rue's chin on her shoulder and Rue in the corridor all night, and Rue at the laundry threshold with the precision of an animal who had drawn a line it would not cross. And she thought about how a border collie reads a space, not through the limited and largely visual apparatus that humans rely on, but through smell and pressure and temperature and sound in frequencies that human hearing could not access, through the accumulated sensory data of a species that has been reading environments for predators and threats since long before the species had a name. Rue had read the space beneath that house. She had read it on arrival in the car, before she had even left the vehicle. She had read it, and she had drawn her line, and she had held her line for the entire duration of their stay, and the line she had drawn was not the line of a frightened dog. Nadia understood the difference between a frightened dog and a vigilant one, had understood it for 6 years. It was the line of a dog performing a function, the line of an animal that has identified something that requires watching, and has assigned itself to the watching with the complete and undistracted commitment of a working dog given a task that matches its capability. Rue had been standing guard. She had been standing guard over Nadia, and the thing she had been standing guard against had been 12 feet below the bedroom floorboards for an unknown duration, in a dark enclosed space, separated from the guest by a door that locked from Nadia's side and not from his. She thought about that. She thought about the key on the ring, not as an accident, not as an oversight. She had been thinking about it as an oversight since she first noticed it, in the way that the mind reaches for the most available explanation rather than the most accurate one, in the way that a 4.9 rating and 342 reviews creates a presumption of legitimacy that is very difficult to see past until you are in the car, in a servo car park, in Mapleton with a meat pie wrapper in your lap and your dog's chin on the console. The key had been on the ring deliberately, because without it, in the event of an emergency, Nadia could not have opened the door. The lock on the laundry side was not there to keep the sun in. She had assumed this, and the assumption was wrong, because a lock that keeps someone in does not give the guests the key to it. The lock was there because the door opened outward, and without a catch of some kind, the door would not stay closed against the pressure of the space's own air. And the key was provided because in the event that the guest needed to access the space for any practical reason, a plumbing emergency, a power issue, a drainage problem of the funny kind the host had mentioned, the key would allow them to do so. The lock was there to keep the door closed. The key was provided because the host considered the arrangement managed and the space safe in the sun's presence a private matter that did not require disclosure because it would not affect the guest's experience in any meaningful way. She had considered it managed. She had managed it across 4 years and 342 guests. And perhaps she had been right. in the sense that 341 of those guests had come and stayed and left and reviewed and not known, and the Toowoomba woman had known or suspected something and had written that the hinterland was perhaps not for everyone, and had given 3 stars and driven home, and that had been the extent of it. Nadia sat in the car and she thought about what kind of life that was for a person, the son, whose name she did not know, and whose face she had not seen, and whose presence she had experienced as a warmth at a door's edge, and a weight shifting in the dark, and the smell of instant coffee in an enclosed space. She thought about it for a long time, not with fear, which she had largely exhausted in the drive down the driveway, and not with anger, which she had deposited in the message to Genevieve M. and the call to Constable Webb, with something that was closer to the feeling she got in clinical practice, when a patient's presentation resolved into an understanding that was both clearer and more complicated than the presenting symptom had suggested. The feeling of a situation that was not simply frightening, but was also, beneath the frightening, genuinely sad. A man living under a house, not in the way of a dramatic and deliberate concealment with sinister purpose, not in the register of the horror film that several people had apparently referenced in the comments of similar viral accounts, not with the architecture of intent that makes a thing evil rather than simply profoundly broken, in the way of a man for whom, at some point and for some reason, the space beneath his family's property had become the available space. The space where he could be without being required to navigate whatever navigating the world above the floor required of him. The dark and warm and enclosed space, with his kettle and his instant coffee. Below the footsteps of the guests his mother welcomed with Shiraz on the bench and a dog bowl in the laundry. Below the footsteps. She thought about Patricia, counting the footsteps in the ward corridor, twice a night, the sound of care making itself known in the only register available to it. She thought, some people need a very small world to be safe in. She thought, the problem is not that he needed a small world. The problem is that his small world was also someone else's rented space, and the someone else was not told. She booked a different property on the coast through a different platform, a studio apartment in Mululaba, whose listing photographs included every corner of every room, including the bathroom and the laundry and the space beneath the kitchen sink, photographed with the thoroughness of someone who understood that what you do not show is what people worry about, and whose host had a response rate of 100% and an average response time of under 1 hour. She drove to Mululaba. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a low-rise block 2 streets from the beach, and it smelled of the salt air that came through the sliding door to the balcony, and the particular clean smell of a space that had been recently and thoroughly prepared for its next occupant, and there was nothing beneath the floor except the 2nd floor, and the 2nd floor was occupied by a retired couple from Hervey Bay, who Nadia could hear, faintly, watching the television through the floor at a volume appropriate to people who have reached the age at which they have accepted that their hearing has its own perspective on what constitutes audible. She unpacked properly this time. She hung things in the wardrobe and put her toiletries in the bathroom, and arranged ruse bowls on the kitchen mat, and opened the balcony door and sat in the salt air with her legs extended on the balcony railing and looked at the ocean, which was doing what the ocean did in the mid-afternoon on the Sunshine Coast, which was to be blue and specific and indifferent to everything that was not itself, which was exactly the quality she needed from it. Rue sat beside her with her face into the salt wind. At 4 in the afternoon, Constable Webb called back. He said, "We attended the property. The host was cooperative. The son, whose name is Marcus, was present in the underhouse space. He has been living there on and off for approximately 2 years, primarily on weekends and during guest stays." Nadia said, "During guest stays." He said, The host indicated he preferred the underhouse space to the main house during periods of stress, and that guest stays represented a predictable and contained period, during which the routine was clear. Her words were that he found it calming. He said this in the tone of someone reading from notes, which was the tone of someone who has decided that the factual delivery of a thing is less likely to go wrong than the evaluative delivery, and whose professional experience has taught them that this is correct. Nadia said. Was any action taken? He said. The property has been flagged and the listing has been deactivated by the platform. Marcus has been referred to community support services. There are no current grounds for criminal charges, as there was no evidence of intent to harm and the door was lockable from the guest side at all times. But I want to be clear. What you did in leaving the property and making the report was correct. It was the right thing to do, she said. Is he all right? Constable Webb paused. He said, he is with his mother. She said, that is not the same as all right. He said, no, it is not. She thanked him and ended the call and sat with the phone on her knee and the ocean in front of her, and the salt air moved through the balcony door and through her hair, and Rue leaned against her leg with the warm and specific weight of an animal that has done its work and is now simply present, simply here, simply the good and steady fact of herself in the salt afternoon. Nadia thought about Marcus in the dark space, with the warmth of occupation and the instant coffee and the footsteps of the guests on the floor above him, the predictable and contained rhythm of people who did not know he was there, the routine that was clear, the calming regularity of a world reduced to its most manageable dimensions. She thought about what it costs a person to need the world that small. She thought about what it costs the people who love that person to provide it, badly, secretly, in the only way they have found that works. She thought about Genevieve M. in the wide-brimmed hat receiving light, who had managed this for 2 years and 4 years of listing and 342 reviews, who had put the key on the ring and the Shiraz on the bench and the dog bowl in the laundry, who had written, "Make yourself at home" in the arrival instructions with the specific and practiced warmth of someone who has been offering that invitation for so long. It has become the truest thing. She knows how to say, "Make yourself at home." Marcus, below the floor, had. She sat on the balcony until the light went and the ocean went from blue to gray to the particular dark of coastal water at night, which is the dark of a surface that is moving even when it appears to be still. And then she went inside, and she made dinner, and she ate it at the kitchen table, and she tasted it this time, and Rue was on the mat with her bowls, and the retired couple below were still watching their television, and the salt air came through the balcony door all evening, and the floor was simply the floor, and beneath it was simply the floor below, and beneath that was simply the ground, and the ground held nothing except the building's footings, and the red Queensland soil, and the roots of the Norfolk pines that lined the block's perimeter, and the ordinary darkness of a space that was dark because there was no light in it, and for no other reason at all. She slept for 9 hours, and in the morning the ocean was still there, and Rue was on the end of the bed with her head on Nadia's feet, and the world above the floor was everything there was, and it was enough, and it was ordinary, and the ordinary was the thing she had come here for, and she lay in it for a long time before she got up, just to make sure it would hold. She stayed the full week. Not from stubbornness, not from the determination to extract value from a holiday that had begun badly, but from the recognition that what the Mululaba apartment offered her was precisely what she had driven 2 hours north to find, and that finding it on the second attempt rather than the first was not a reason to abandon it. The salt air was real. The ocean view was real. The retired couple below, watching their evening television at a volume that took no prisoners, were real, and their realness, their uncomplicated, floor-vibrating, absolutely nothing to investigate realness, was a quality she found herself grateful for in a way she had not anticipated, being grateful for the sounds of a television through a floor. She developed a routine across the remaining days in the way that a person develops a routine in an unfamiliar place when they have made the decision to stay. Not the routine of habit, which is assembled over months and years and accommodates the full complexity of a life, but the provisional routine of a week, which is simpler and more deliberate, each element chosen rather than accumulated. She woke early, before 6, because the apartment's east-facing balcony received the first light, and the sliding door she left open for the salt air also admitted the sound of the ocean in the early morning, which was a different sound from the daytime ocean. Lower, more continuous, less punctuated by the sounds of people and watercraft, the ocean doing its baseline work without an audience. She took Rue to the beach before the dogs off-lead restriction came into effect at 9, and Rue ran on the hard sand at the water's edge in the specific way of border collies at the beach, which was to run, not for the pleasure of running, but for the disciplined purpose of running, a self-assigned task whose objective was the coverage of as much sand as possible in the available time, performed with the focused intensity of a dog who understood that effort was its own justification. She had coffee on the balcony. She ate well. Not the eating of a person mechanically fueling herself, but the eating of someone who has remembered that food is a thing she is capable of enjoying, who has found the fish and chip shop 2 streets from the apartment and the bakery in the arcade on the esplanade and the Vietnamese place that did not look like much from the street, and was inside the kind of quiet and specific and unhurried restaurant that exists in every coastal town and is known only to the people who live there and the occasional visitor who wanders in without a recommendation. In the afternoons, she sat on the balcony and she read, and on the third afternoon she did not read, she simply sat, which she had not done in the specific sense of simply sitting, not sitting while doing something, not sitting while thinking about something that needed thinking about, but sitting as an end in itself, in longer than she could accurately recall. She thought about Daniel intermittently, in the way that a person thinks about the end of something that mattered during a period set aside for the purpose of thinking about it. Not the catastrophizing thought of the flat at midnight, but the slower and more honest thought available to a person who is sitting in salt air with their dog and their coffee and a view of the ocean, who has survived something and is in the recovery stage of the survival, who is beginning to understand the shape of what comes next without yet knowing all of its dimensions. She thought about Marcus more than she expected to, not with fear, which had mostly resolved into the background radiation of unease that she expected would persist for some time and would eventually become simply one of the things that had happened to her, filed alongside the other things that had happened to her, and that she had incorporated into the ongoing account of being herself, with something she kept returning to and could not resolve into any of the available categories. Not sympathy exactly, not pity exactly, not the clinical detachment of someone assessing a case, but something that had elements of all three, and was also something else, something that had no clean name. She had texted her colleague Britta on the third morning. Britta was a psychologist, the kind of psychologist who had ended up in her discipline through the convergence of intellectual curiosity and a personal history that had given her a specific and useful understanding of the various ways people find to manage what they cannot face directly. She had been Nadia's closest friend for 8 years, and she had the quality that Nadia valued most in a friend, which was the quality of being able to receive information without the information immediately generating advice, of being willing to simply hold something before responding to it. She texted, "Something happened at the first rental. Not dangerous in the end, but I keep thinking about the person involved. A man living in the space beneath the house. 2 years. His mother managed the rental around him. I think he had significant mental health difficulties. I did the right things. Left, reported it. The platform deactivated the listing. But I keep thinking about what his life looks like, the size of it. Britta replied after 11 minutes, which was the duration Nadia had learned to associate with Britta reading something twice before responding. She wrote, "The part that stays with you is usually the part that has something to say to you about something in your own experience. Not the same thing. Something adjacent. What does the size of his world remind you of?" Nadia read this and put the phone face down on the balcony railing. She looked at the ocean. She thought, what does the size of his world remind me of? She thought about the flat in Brisbane and the 11 months before the hinterland trip and the specific dimensions that life had occupied across those 11 months. The clinic, 4 days a week. The routes between the clinic and the flat that she had walked with the unthinking automaticity of a person who has learned a route so completely that the route requires no attention and generates no experience. Simply transit. The Saturday mornings with Rue at the dog park 3 streets from the flat. The 2 friends she had maintained across the relationship with Daniel because they were her friends rather than the relationship's friends. And the maintenance of those friendships that had become, across the 11 months, less a matter of genuine connection and more a matter of attendance. She showed up, she participated, she went home. The weekly call to her mother in Cairns, which lasted 25 minutes and covered the same ground the previous call had covered, was in a rotation so established that she occasionally caught herself at minute 14, anticipating her mother's next sentence before it arrived. The evenings, the long, specific evenings of the flat, with Rue on the couch and something on the television and the Daniel-shaped absence organized into the furniture and the dishes and the half of the wardrobe that was now hers, only because nothing was stopping it from being hers, and the days passing in the compact and manageable loop of a life reduced to its most survivable dimensions. She picked up the phone. She texted Britta, "It reminds me of the past 11 months." Britta replied, "Yes." 1 word, which was the right word. The word of someone who had been waiting for Nadia to arrive at something and was confirming the arrival without inflating it. Nadia put the phone down and looked at the ocean. And she thought about the difference between a life reduced to its survivable dimensions by necessity and a life expanded deliberately beyond them. And she thought about which of those she had been doing for the past 11 months and which of them she intended to do for the next period of time, however long the next period of time was. She did not have an answer that was fully formed. But she had the question which she had not had before the hinterland road and the frangipani and the white door, and the question was the thing she understood that the week had been assembling toward, not the answer, which was not available in a single week on the Sunshine Coast to a person who had been living in a loop for 11 months, but the recognition that the loop existed, and that the recognition of its existence was the necessary precondition for anything that came after. On the 5th day, she called her mother, not on the scheduled Saturday. On a Thursday afternoon from the balcony, with the ocean in front of her and Rue asleep on the tiles at her feet in the sun's last warmth, her mother answered with the particular surprise of someone receiving a call outside the established pattern, the surprise that contains within it the brief flutter of parental concern before the voice resolved into relief. She said, "Nadia, is everything all right?" Nadia said, "Yes. I am at Mooloolaba. I wanted to call." Her mother said, "You are on holiday." She said, "I was meant to be somewhere in the hinterland. Something happened at the first place, and I moved." Her mother said, "What happened?" She told her, not the version she had told Constable Webb, which was precise and sequential and organized around the reportable facts. The other version, the version that included Rue in the corridor all night, and the warmth at the door's edge, and the smell of instant coffee, and the Louvre blades moving in still air, and the drive down the driveway with Rue's chin on her shoulder and her hands steady in the way of hands after an emergency, and what she had been thinking about since, which was not primarily the fear, but the shape of a life compressed to its smallest survivable form, and what it means to be the person who needs that compression, and the person who manages it around them, and the person who arrives in the middle of it having been told none of it. Her mother listened. She was a good listener, her mother, not the reflexive listener who interrupts to offer parallel experience, but the genuine listener who holds the space of the conversation open by simply not filling it with anything of her own until the space has been used for what it was opened for. When Nadia finished, her mother said, "I am glad you left," she said. "So am I," her mother said, "and I am glad you called on a Thursday." The way she said it had a quality that Nadia recognized as the quality of someone who has been waiting for something and is being careful not to make the waiting's length a weight on the thing it was waiting for. She said, "I know. I have been in a loop," her mother said. "I know you have," she said. "I am going to be less in a loop." Her mother said, "You do not have to promise me things," she said. "I know. I want to say it anyway." They talked for 40 minutes, which was 15 minutes longer than the usual call, and which felt, at no point, like the scheduled maintenance of a connection. It felt like a conversation between two people who had a great deal of ground in common and had been walking separate sections of it for a period of time, and were now walking the same section, which was the section about what came next for Nadia, and what came next for her mother and Cairns, and what came next for both of them, in the sense of whether next could include being in the same place with some regularity rather than the same place twice a year for the established and predictable occasions. Her mother said, "You could come to Cairns at Easter, not for Christmas, not for a birthday." Easter, which was not an occasion they had marked together since Nadia was in her mid-20s, which was precisely the absence of occasion that made the invitation feel like what it was, which was an invitation to simply be in the same place, because being in the same place was worthwhile, without the armature of occasion to justify it. Nadia said yes. Her mother said, "I will look up what is on," she said. "Nothing has to be on." Her mother was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet there was the quality of someone receiving a small gift and not being certain how to hold it without making too much of it. She said, "No, nothing has to be on." After the call, Nadia sat with the phone in her lap, and the ocean doing its evening work below the esplanade, and the salt air moving through her hair, and she thought about the week she had left before she went back to Brisbane. And she thought about the week as a thing with its own shape, rather than a gap between the previous thing and the next one. The week as the thing itself rather than the interval. She thought about Genevieve M., and whether Genevieve M. had read her final message, and what she had done with it. She thought about Marcus's referred to community support services with his mother. She thought about what it would take for a person who had lived for 2 years in the space beneath a house to live in the house itself, and she thought about whether that was the direction the support services would try to move him in, and whether it was the right direction, or whether there was a direction that was more honest about what he needed, which was something she did not know enough about his specific situation to determine, and which was, in any case, not something she could determine from a balcony in Mululaba. But she thought about it. She thought about what Dr. Marsh had said to Dean, whoever Dean was, whatever his story was. She did not know his story and was not constructing it. She was simply borrowing the structure of what Dr. Marsh had said because it was the most accurate thing she had encountered for the thing she was trying to think about. That the building was not malevolent, that what it held was organized around a particular quality of attention, that the attachment was consuming in proportion to how long the pain had been unattended, the pain of a life too large to navigate, the solution of a life compressed to its most manageable form. The problem of compressing your life into a space that was also someone else's rented accommodation, she thought. The solution was not wrong. The solution was the wrong size. The solution needed to be large enough for one person, not large enough for one person beneath however many guests across 4 years. She thought about what a large enough for one person solution looked like for Marcus, and she did not know. And she sat with not knowing it, in the way that you sit with something you cannot resolve when you have accepted that not resolving it is an honest response to the available information. On the last evening, she walked Rue along the esplanade after dark, the beach lit by the esplanade lights and the moon, the water doing its black and silver thing, the couples and the joggers and the dog walkers doing their established circuits in the warm coastal evening. She let Rue off the lead in the section of beach the signs designated for after hours off lead, and Rue ran her coverage pattern in the available dark, the white and black of her coat visible across the wet sand in the moonlight, and Nadia walked slowly in the opposite direction and then back, and they met in the middle, and Rue matched her pace, and they walked together at the water's edge with the small waves arriving and retreating around their feet, and the esplanade lights behind them and the open ocean ahead. She thought, I came here to breathe. She thought, I am breathing. Not because the week had resolved anything about Daniel or the flat or the 11 months of the loop or the question of what came next. Because the week had given her the question, which was the thing before the resolution, the thing without which the resolution had nothing to work on. The question was, what do I want the next space to be? Not the flat. She knew what the flat was. She knew it in the way of something she had been living in long enough to know it entirely. Not the Mululaba apartment, which was a weak space, a borrowed space, a space that had been exactly what she needed it to be for exactly as long as she needed it. Something between those things. Something she did not yet know the shape of, and could not know the shape of from here, and was going to have to go back to Brisbane to begin to find out. Which was not a comfortable conclusion, but was an honest one. Rue came back from the far end of the beach and fell in beside her, and they turned and walked back toward the esplanade together, and the ocean was behind them now, and the lights of the esplanade were ahead, and the warm Queensland night was around them, and the ground under their feet was solid and wet and specific and real. She thought about the undercroft one more time. Not with fear, and not with the complicated feeling she had been working through across the week, but simply with the straightforward and honest acknowledgement of something that had happened and that she had moved through, and that had given her something she had not expected to receive from a week. On the Sunshine Coast, she had gone there to breathe. She had found a door she had not been told about. She had left it locked. And what she was bringing back to Brisbane was not the fear of what was behind it, but the understanding, the clear, specific, hard-won understanding of what happens when a life is reduced to the dimensions of a locked space, and what it costs to maintain those dimensions, and what it requires of the person above the floor to stop organizing their days around the rhythms of absence and begin, deliberately and without a map, to open the door. Not that door. Not any door that exists only because something in you requires a world small enough to survive, but the other kind. The door that opens outward into the size of the life that is actually available to you. The life above the floor. The life that has been there all along. Waiting with the patient and entirely undramatic availability of a thing that does not need to announce itself because it is simply there. Every morning, when you open the balcony door and the salt air comes in. She drove back to Brisbane on a Sunday morning. Not the direct route. She took the coast road instead of the highway. The road that stayed with the ocean longer before surrendering it to the inland scrub and the suburban sprawl of the city's northern edge, because she was not in a hurry, and because she had learned something across the week about the value of taking the route that gave you more, rather than the route that got you there faster, which was a lesson that sounded obvious when stated plainly, and was apparently not obvious enough to have been operating in her life for the previous 11 months. The coast road in the early morning was the coast road at its best. Low traffic, the ocean appearing and disappearing between the headlands in long blue glimpses, the air still carrying the particular quality of coastal dawn before the heat had fully committed to the day. Rue was in the back, with the window down the precise amount that border collies prefer, which was not all the way down because all the way down was too much information arriving too quickly, but enough that the full catalog of the morning's smells could be processed in real time as the car moved through them. She stopped at a headland lookout south of Calandra and sat on the bonnet with her coffee thermos and looked at the ocean for 20 minutes, and Rue sat beside her with her shoulder against Nadia's thigh and her face into the offshore wind, and the ocean was doing what the ocean does from a headland at dawn, which is to make the idea of hurrying seem like a category error. The ocean being so comprehensively indifferent to the human concept of schedule that proximity to it tends to reorganize a person's sense of what constitutes an urgency. She thought about the flat, not with dread, which had been the primary register in which she had thought about the flat for the previous 11 months, but with something more measured, more honest. The flat was a space she had been living in wrong, using it as the site of an endurance rather than the site of a life, and the endurance was a thing she had been doing, not because the flat was unlivable, but because she had organized herself around the absence of Daniel in a way that made the flat primarily a record of his departure, rather than a space available for what came after. She thought about what she wanted to do to it. Not cosmetically, not paint, not furniture, not the renovation instinct that arrives when a relationship ends and the walls suddenly seem complicit in everything that happened within them. Something more fundamental than paint. She wanted to change what she used the flat for, which was a thing that preceded any physical change and did not require one. She wanted to have people in it. Not the managed, infrequent logistics requiring social events of the previous 11 months, which had the quality of performances rather than occasions, carefully prepared for and carefully conducted and exhausting in proportion to their infrequency. She wanted Britta in the kitchen on a weeknight, drinking wine and talking about nothing in particular with the ease of two people who have been talking about nothing in particular for long enough that the nothing in particular has become a shared language. She wanted her colleague James, who had been asking her to join the regular Tuesday evening trail run group for 4 months, and who she had been declining with the particular inventiveness of someone who has run out of genuine excuses and has begun recycling old ones with minor modifications. She wanted her mother at Easter, not in the formal sense of hosting, not with the preparation anxiety of an occasion. She wanted her mother to arrive on a Thursday evening and put her bag in the second bedroom and wake up on Friday morning and ask where the coffee was with the ease of someone who had been there before and expected to be there again. She thought about the size of the life she was describing, and it was larger than the previous 11 months version by a significant margin, and the largeness of it was not frightening. This was new information. She had thought, not consciously, not as a stated belief, but as a background assumption that had been organizing her behavior without her examining it. That expansion required energy she did not have, that the loop's dimensions were the dimensions of what was currently possible, that the manageable smallness of the established routine was a form of self-knowledge rather than a form of contraction. The hinterland road and the white door and Marcus below the floor, and the 5 days in Mululaba had collectively produced a correction to this assumption. And the correction was not comfortable, but it was accurate, and she had enough clinical experience with the difference between comfortable and accurate to trust the accurate thing, even when the comfortable thing was more immediately appealing. She drove into Brisbane on the Gateway Bridge approach, the city arriving in the familiar arrangement of its towers and the river's loops below the bridge, the familiar gray-green of the suburban canopy, and the flat was in West End, which was 40 minutes from the bridge in Sunday morning traffic, which was 40 minutes of the city reassembling itself around her as a known quantity after the week of the unfamiliar. She parked in her usual space in the building's basement, and she sat in the car for a moment after the engine went off. She said to Rue, "We are back." Rue was already at the car door, ready, the border collie's commitment to the next thing total, and without nostalgia for the previous thing, which was a quality Nadia had always admired in her, and was now for the first time consciously attempting to emulate. They went upstairs. The flat was exactly as she had left it. The Daniel-shaped arrangement of the furniture, the half-wardrobe, the dish rack with its established geometry. She walked through it and opened the windows and the balcony door and let the Brisbane Sunday morning in, which smelled of river and jacaranda and the coffee from the cafe on the corner that ran its machine from 7. And she stood in the cross-draft and let the flat breathe around her. Then she moved the couch, not dramatically, 3 feet to the left and angled slightly toward the balcony, which opened the sightline from the kitchen to the balcony door, and changed the room from a room organized around the television to a room organized around the light, and the change was small and took 4 minutes and cost her nothing, and made the room demonstrably different in a way she could feel before she had finished doing it. The room becoming a room she had chosen, rather than a room she had inherited from the arrangement of the previous version of her life. Rue investigated the couch in its new position with the thoroughness of an animal for whom spatial change is genuine information, and then she got on it and settled with the philosophical ease of a dog who has determined that the couch is still the couch regardless of its coordinates. Nadia went to the kitchen and made proper coffee and drank it standing at the balcony door, looking at the Sunday street, and she thought about the list of things she was going to do this week, which was a different kind of list from the list she usually made on a Sunday, which was a list of obligations organized around the minimum required to keep the various systems of her life functional. This list was different. It had on it, "Call Britta," not a text, an actual call, and say yes to Thursday dinner rather than hedging toward maybe. Email James about the Tuesday trail run. Call the lease office about whether she could install a garden bed on the balcony, which she had been wanting to do for 2 years and had not done because it fell into the category of things that constituted investment in the flat as a space. An investment in the flat as a space had felt during Daniel's departure and the 11 months after it like a thing she would do when she knew whether she was staying. She was staying, not because she had decided the flat was permanent, not because the question of the future had resolved into a specific and nameable answer, but because she was here now, and the now was the space available, and she was going to use it rather than hold it in abeyance against a future that had not yet declared its dimensions. She was drinking her second coffee when her phone showed a notification from the platform. Not Genevieve M., the platform itself. A formal message in the style of their administrative communications, informing her that her complaint had been reviewed, that the listing in question had been permanently deactivated, and that a full refund had been processed to her original payment method. The message included a paragraph about the platform's commitment to guest safety, and a link to their help center and a case reference number. She read it and put the phone down. She thought about the permanent deactivation and what it meant for Marcus, for whom the underhouse space was presumably no longer available as an option, or at least no longer available in its previous configuration of managed invisibility. And she thought about community support services and whether community support services were the right scale of intervention for a person whose difficulties with the world above the floor were serious, enough to have sustained a 2-year arrangement of this particular kind. She did not know. She was a physiotherapist, not a psychologist, and the question was outside the range of what she could usefully assess from the information she had. She had done the things available to her. She had left, she had reported, she had maintained the hope, expressed in her final message to Genevieve M., that Marcus would get what he needed. Whether he would get what he needed was not something she could determine or control. This was uncomfortable. She sat with the discomfort in the way she had been learning to sit with things across the week, not resolving it prematurely, not converting it into action, simply to discharge the feeling, but letting it be what it was, which was the honest discomfort of a caring person in the presence of a situation she could not fix. She opened her laptop. She found the Australian mental health support directory she used when referring patients to resources outside her clinical scope, and she searched for community support services in the Sunshine Coast hinterland region, and she found 3 organizations whose services were relevant to the kind of difficulty she understood Marcus to be experiencing, and she wrote their names and contact details on a piece of paper, and she looked at the piece of paper, and she thought about what she was going to do with it. She wrote a letter, not an email, not a message through the platform, a letter on actual paper, because a letter has a weight and a deliberateness that electronic communication does not have, and because what she wanted to say deserved the weight of a letter, rather than the efficiency of a message. She addressed it to Genevieve M. at the property address which she had from the platform booking confirmation. She wrote, "I do not know if you will read this. I want you to know that the report I made was not made out of anger, though I understand if it felt that way. It was made because the situation required it, and because I believe that what you were doing, however much it came from a place of love for your son, was not sustainable and was not safe, not for your guests and not for Marcus. What I want to say, which is not something a formal complaint allows room for, is that what your son needs is not a smaller world. What he needs is support in building a world that is the right size for him, which is larger than an undercroft, but may be smaller than the world that currently overwhelms him, and which is a thing that people are specifically trained to help with. I have included the details of 3 organizations in your area that may be useful. I hope he is all right. I hope you are all right. What you have been carrying is very heavy." She signed it with her first name only. She folded the letter around the piece of paper with the 3 organizations' details, and she put it in an envelope, and she addressed the envelope, and she found a stamp in the kitchen drawer where stamps coexisted with takeaway menus and the spare key for Britta and a torch whose battery she had been meaning to replace for 6 months. And she pressed the stamp to the envelope, and she put the envelope by the door to post on her way out later. She looked at the envelope. She thought about Genevieve M. reading the letter, and whether she would read it, and whether the letter would be useful or whether it would be an intrusion. And she thought about how you cannot know whether a thing you send into the world will be received as you intend it, and how that uncertainty is not a reason to not send it, because the alternative is to keep the thing inside yourself, where it is definitely not going to reach the person it needs to reach. She called Britta. Britta answered on the second ring with the voice of someone who had been expecting this call on the basis of the Thursday text thread. and had been patiently waiting for it to arrive. She said, "You are back." Nadia said, "I am back. Are you free Thursday?" Britta said, "I have been free on Thursdays for 3 years, waiting for you to ask." She said this with the warmth of someone who has been waiting a long time and is choosing to make the length of the wait into a gentle joke rather than a wait, because she understood that the weight of the wait was already part of what Nadia was carrying and did not need to be added to. Nadia said, "I am going to cook. Come at 7. Britta said, "I will bring wine." She said, "Bring the good wine." I moved the couch. Britta was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone registering information and understanding its significance. She said, "Which way?" Nadia said, "Toward the light." Britta said, "Good." They talked for 40 minutes about nothing urgent, which was the most useful 40 minutes the phone had been used for in 11 months. And when Nadia ended the call, she stood in the kitchen with the sundae around her and the coffee going cold in the mug and Rue asleep on the couch in its new position, and the flat was the same flat and also a different flat, the same 4 walls holding a different quality of the morning. And she thought about how a space changes not when you change its surfaces, but when you change what you use it for, when you change the intention you bring to it, when you stop using it as the site of waiting and begin using it as the site of the thing you have been waiting for, which is not a person and not a resolution and not a future you can specify, but simply the ongoing and available and entirely ordinary fact of your own life happening in real time in the space you actually occupy. She posted the letter on the way to buy groceries. She stood at the post box on the corner for a moment with the envelope in her hand, and she thought about the undercroft and the white door and the warmth at the door's edge and the Louvre blades moving in still air. And she thought about Marcus with his kettle and his instant coffee in the dark below the floor. And she thought about Genevieve M. with her 342 reviews and her wide-brimmed hat and her practiced warmth and the weight she had been carrying across 4 years of managing the unmanageable. She posted the letter. She bought groceries, the kind of groceries that required actual cooking, rather than the assembly of things that did not require heat, and she carried them home in the string bags she had brought from the flat, rather than the plastic bags the shop provided, which was a thing she had always intended to do and had been doing inconsistently for 2 years and was now, for no particular reason except that she had decided going to do consistently. Small thing. The kind of small thing that does not matter in itself and matters entirely as an indication of a person who has decided to do what they intend rather than intending to do what they have not yet gotten around to. She cooked dinner for herself that evening, and she ate it at the table rather than at the couch, and she tasted it, and afterwards she took her tea to the balcony. And she looked at the Brisbane Sunday evening, which was the Brisbane Sunday evening of 100 previous Sunday evenings, ordinary and specific and entirely actually there. Rue came to the balcony and sat beside her and put her chin on the railing and looked at the street below with the meditative quality of a border collie who has completed her assessments and found no current cause for vigilance and is now simply being present, which for Rue was a thing that looked identical to vigilance but had a different quality at its center, a quieter and more open quality, the quality of an animal at rest in its environment rather than an animal engaged with a threat. Nadia looked at Rue, she thought, all week in the corridor, on the stairs, at the fence line, at the car door, with her chin on my shoulder. All of it a form of care that required nothing from me except that I receive it, except that I let her do the thing she was built to do, which was to stay close and pay attention and sound the alarm and stand the long watch without being asked and without acknowledgement and without the alarm needing to amount to anything other than the fact that she was there. She put her hand on Rue's back. The warmth of her was specific and real, and the specific warmth of a particular animal who was not interchangeable with any other animal and who had chosen, in whatever way a border collie chooses anything, to be exactly here, on this balcony, with her chin on this railing attending. Nadia thought, I have been doing this wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not irreparably wrong. Simply wrong in the small and correctable way of a person who has been looking at the available light and choosing, for reasons that made sense at the time and make less sense now, to sit in the part of the room away from it. The correction was not complicated. It was the couch moved 3 feet to the left. It was Thursday dinner and the good wine. It was the trail run on Tuesday, and the garden bed on the balcony, and the Easter in Cairns and the stamp on the letter. It was the 40-minute phone call to her mother on a Thursday with nothing on. It was all of these things, ordinary and available and requiring no more than the decision to reach for them, rather than the decision to wait until reaching felt more justified, more earned, more certain of its outcome. She sat on the balcony until the Sunday evening completed itself and the street went quiet, and the cafe on the corner closed its machine, and the Brisbane night settled into its warm and river-scented. Dark, and Rue was still there, chin on the railing, present and steady and warm, and the tea in Nadia's mug went cold, which she noticed and did not mind, which was its own small thing, its own small correction. She left it cold. She looked at the night. She breathed. The envelope landed in Genevieve M's letterbox on a Wednesday, and Nadia did not know what Genevieve M did with it, and she had made her peace with not knowing, because she had done the thing available to her, and the rest of it was not hers to carry. And on Thursday evening, Britta arrived at 7 with the good wine and looked at the couch in its new position and said nothing for a moment, just stood in the doorway of the flat with the bottle in her hand, and the expression of someone who has been hoping for something for a long time and has just seen evidence that the hoping was warranted. And then she came in and set the wine on the bench and said something that made Nadia laugh, and the laugh was real, and the flat received it, and the flat held it the way a room holds what is given to it, which is to say completely, and without reservation, and for exactly as long as it needs to. 3 weeks after she returned from Mululaba, Nadia received a letter, not a message through the platform, a letter, physical, on paper, in an envelope with a Maroochydore postmark and a return address she did not recognize, a street number and a suburb name in the hinterland that she had to look up to place, a small community further into the ranges than the property she had stayed at, further from the coast, the kind of inland hinterland address that suggested a deliberate removal from convenience rather than a proximity to it. The envelope arrived in her building's letterbox on a Tuesday evening, when she was coming back from the trail run, the first one she had attended with James and the group, which had been exactly what she had expected it to be, and which she had been declining for 4 months. The specific physical pleasure of moving through the city's river trails in the company of people who were primarily focused on the running rather than on the social performance of running, which meant the conversation was the kind that happened in the gaps between the running rather than the reason for the gathering, easy and intermittent and without the effort of occasion. She had her phone in her hand and her running shoes wet from the river path, and Rue's lead in the other hand when she opened the letter box and found the envelope among the bills and the real estate, flyers and the community newsletter, and she stood in the building's lobby, and she looked at the handwriting on the address, which was not Genevieve M's, and then at the return address, which was the address she did not recognize, and she did not open it in the lobby. She went upstairs. She put Rue's lead on its hook, and she filled the water bowl, and she changed out of the running gear, and she made tea, and she sat at the kitchen table with the envelope, and she held it for a moment before she opened it, in the way of someone who has learned that the quality of receiving something matters, that opening a letter while standing in a lobby is a different act from opening it at a table with tea in the deliberate posture of a person prepared to receive what the envelope contains. She opened it. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten on unlined paper in a handwriting that was not Genevieve M's polished script. This handwriting was different, less practiced, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who did not write by hand frequently, and was doing it now for a specific reason that made the effort necessary. Each letter formed with the slight deliberateness of a person concentrating on the act of formation rather than on the act of expression, so that the writing had about it a quality of labor that was also a quality of intention. The intention of something that had taken some time and some difficulty to produce. It said, "My name is Marcus. My mother showed me your letter. I do not know if she was supposed to show me or if she just did because she did not know what else to do with it." She cried when she read it. She does not usually cry in front of me, so that was different. I want to explain some things because I think the explanation is something I owe you, though I understand if you do not want to read it. I have been unwell for a long time. Not in the way of being sick with something that has a name and a treatment and a clear trajectory, though there are names and there have been treatments, and the trajectory has not been particularly clear. In the way of finding the world above a certain size very difficult to navigate, a difficulty that has been with me in various forms since I was in my early 20s, and that has not responded to the available interventions in the way that the people administering the interventions would have preferred. The space beneath the house was not something I planned. It began with one weekend, approximately 2 years ago, when I was staying with my mother and the world felt particularly large, and I found that the enclosed space beneath the house, where I had been helping her with a plumbing issue, had a quality that the rooms above did not have. It was the right size. I do not know how else to say that. It was the right size for what I needed the world to be at that time, and I stayed the weekend there rather than in the guest room, and my mother found me there, and she did not ask me to leave. I want you to know that I was aware of the guests throughout my stays in the space, not in any intrusive sense. I was aware of the footsteps and the ordinary sounds of people going about their days above me, and I found these sounds helpful in the same way that I found the space itself helpful, which is difficult to explain, but which I will try. When the world is very large, one of the things that becomes difficult is the feeling of being unmoored from it, not suffering in it exactly, but floating in it, without the points of reference that allow a person to know where they are, and what the next thing is, and whether the next thing will be manageable. The sounds of other people going about ordinary lives provided those reference points without requiring me to participate in the lives that were producing them. The footsteps at predictable intervals, the sounds of cooking and conversation, the small domestic noises of people who were safe and going about their day. These things told me where I was in time. They told me the day was structured and the structure was holding. I did not need to be part of the structure. I only needed to know it was there. I understand that this was not a fair use of other people's ordinary lives. I understand that you did not consent to providing me with this, and that if you had known I was there, you would not have consented, and that the absence of consent makes what I receive from you a theft rather than a gift, regardless of my intention or my need. I am sorry for that. I want to be specific about the apology because I think a general apology for the whole situation is less useful than a specific one for the specific thing that was wrong, and what was specifically wrong was the consent. I needed something, and I took it from a situation in which the person who could have given or withheld it did not know they were being asked. I have been talking to someone from one of the organizations you listed in your letter. Not because my mother asked me to, though she did ask me to. Because I read your letter and something in it was accurate. In a way that things are rarely accurate about the experience of needing a very small world. You said what he needs is support in building a world that is the right size for him. And I read that 3 times, and I thought about the underhouse space and what it had been for me, and I thought, that is precisely the description of what I need, and it had not occurred to me that the description could be made that cleanly by someone who did not know me, which made me think that the thing I need might be more possible than I had allowed myself to believe. I do not know if that is true. I am finding out your dog. Was it a border collie? I could hear her moving in the corridor at night, and in the morning the distinctive sound of a dog who is standing guard rather than simply lying down. I have always respected border collies enormously. They do not pretend to be at ease when they are not at ease. They are honest in the way that very few things are honest. I am sorry I frightened her. Nadia read the letter twice. Then she set it flat on the kitchen table, and she put both hands on the table, beside it, not on the letter itself. And she looked at the handwriting on the 2 pages, and she thought about the labor of it, the deliberateness of the letter formation, each word the product of an effort that the easiness of the email or the text would have made unnecessary. He had chosen the effort. She thought about the description of the footsteps, and the ordinary sounds of people going about their days, and the feeling of being unmoored from the world and needing the sounds of other people's structure to know where you were in time without needing to participate in that produced the sounds. And she thought about how accurately this described something, not his experience exclusively. She recognized something in the description that was not foreign to her. The way a description of a landscape can be accurate about a landscape you have visited, rather than only the landscape the writer intended. She thought about the 11 months. She thought about the loop and the Tuesday walks with Rue, and the scheduled Saturday dog park, and the 25-minute calls to cairns that covered the same ground in the same rotation. And she thought about what she had been using those rhythms for, and whether their primary function had been their stated function, or whether their primary function had been what Marcus was describing. The sounds of a structure that told her where she was in time, without requiring her to be fully present in the time it was describing. The managed loop, the predictable rhythm, the world reduced to its manageable dimensions, maintained not in an undercroft, but in the ordinary above-floor space of a life, maintained through the careful limiting of what the life was asked to contain. She thought, he was below my floor and I was below my own. This was not a comfortable thought, and she sat with the discomfort of it rather than resolving it quickly, because she had been practicing sitting with discomfort rather than resolving it quickly, and the practice was getting easier without getting comfortable, which she was beginning to understand was the correct trajectory. She thought about the trail run, and Britta on Thursday with the good wine, and the letter to Cairns, and the garden bed application she had submitted to the building management, which had been approved, the approval email arriving on Monday, with the particular satisfaction of a bureaucratic process, concluding in the direction of yes. She was building the world back to its right size, not the size it had been before Daniel, which was not necessarily the right size either, which was a thought she had not previously had and was having now, that the right size was not a fixed historical state to return to, but a current and ongoing determination, a question you asked not once, but continuously, a calibration rather than a destination. She thought about Marcus saying the underhouse space was the right size, and understanding this as the right size for what I needed at that time, which was an accurate description of a temporary accommodation of a need rather than a permanent solution to it. and which suggested, reading the letter carefully, that he understood the difference between the two, even if the two had become conflated in practice. She took out a piece of paper. She thought about what to write for a long time before she wrote anything, because what to write was not immediately clear in the way that the impulse to write was immediately clear, and she wanted to honor the effort the letter had cost him with a reply that cost her something equivalent in honesty. She wrote, "Thank you for writing. I read your letter carefully and I read it again. What you described about the footsteps and the sounds, the way other people's ordinary lives provided reference points without requiring participation. I want you to know I understood this more than you might expect from a stranger, not identically, but adjacent to it in a way that made the description accurate rather than alien. Rue is a border collie. You were right. Her name is Rue, and she was standing guard, and she is fine. She would not want you to feel guilty about frightening her, because she is not the kind of dog who holds things against people after the situation has been resolved. She is pragmatic in that specific border collie way, which is the way of an animal that allocates its concern to what is currently in front of it, rather than to what is behind it. I am glad you are talking to someone, not because I think you are required to, not because it is the correct response that the situation demands of you, but because what you said about the description being accurate and that making the possibility more real sounds like the beginning of something rather than an obligation, and the beginning of something is different from an obligation in a way that matters for whether it continues. I do not know if it is appropriate to write again. I am going to leave that to you. If you want to write, I will write back. If you do not, I think this exchange has been what it needed to be, and that is enough. Take care of yourself. Take the time you need. The world above the floor is not going anywhere." She signed it with her name. She put it in an envelope, and she wrote the return address from his letter on the front, and she put a stamp on it, and she set it beside the door, and she looked at the two envelopes that had now passed between herself and this hinterland family in the space of 3 weeks. Her letter out, his letter in, her reply going out, and she thought about the particular kind of correspondence that begins not from shared experience, but from the opposite of shared experience, from an encounter that was defined by what was not disclosed and which has become, through the slow and effortful exchange of written words on actual paper, a disclosure. She thought about Genevieve M. crying when she read the letter. She thought about what it costs to carry a thing for 4 years, to manage a situation around a person you love with the resourcefulness of someone who has run out of other options and has found something that works, something that is not right, but that works, and to carry it across 342 guest stays and 1 3-star review and the daily performance of a warmth that is not fake, but is also not the whole story. She thought the letter was not for Genevieve M. She had addressed it to Genevieve M. and written "Make yourself at home" at the end of it, without intending to, without realizing she had written it, until she was folding the paper and saw it there. And she had left it because it was accurate, because it was the thing she wanted to say to both of them. To the son in his undercroft and the mother in her listing, and the two of them together in the hinterland house above the red soil and the eucalyptus and the frangipani, trying to make a world that was the right size for what they had been given. Make yourself at home. She posted the reply on Wednesday morning on her way to the clinic. She did not hear back from Marcus for 6 weeks, and when she did, the letter was shorter. 1 page, the handwriting slightly easier, the deliberateness still present, but less labored, the way a person's handwriting relaxes when they have done the difficult thing once and are doing it again, not for the first time, but for the second time, which is always measurably easier than the first. He wrote that he had moved into a studio apartment in Nambour. which was a small town in the hinterland, within a manageable distance of his mother, and within walking distance of the support service he had been attending, and that the studio was small, and that the smallness was fine, and that he was getting used to the sounds of the building, which were different from the sounds of the undercroft, but were also sounds he was learning to use as reference points. The couple above him who watched television in the evenings, and the man across the hall who left for work at 6, and whose key in the lock was the first sound of the building's day. He wrote that he had gone to the coast once, on a Saturday morning, and sat on the beach at Mululaba for an hour and watched the ocean, which was very large, and that the size of it had not been as frightening as he had expected, and that he had bought a coffee from a van at the car park and drunk it looking at the water, and that the coffee had been good and the water had been very blue. He wrote, "I think the world is perhaps the right size this morning. I wanted to tell someone that." Nadia read this at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, with Rue in the patch of sun on the new couch, and the garden bed on the balcony with its 3 herbs that she had planted on a Wednesday evening as a deliberate act rather than an intention. Thyme and rosemary and a basil that was already taller than the pot had been designed to contain. Reaching toward the Brisbane light with the uncomplicated ambition of something that has been given the conditions it needs and is simply doing what it was built to do. She thought about the right size. She thought about how it changed, how the right size of a life was not a fixed dimension but a moving one, calibrated against what was currently possible and what was currently needed, and how the calibration required attention rather than resolution, ongoing rather than final. She thought about Marcus on the beach at Mululaba, looking at the ocean. She thought about herself on the headland south of Caloundra with the coffee thermos and Rue's shoulder against her thigh, looking at the same ocean from a different angle, thinking about the flat and the loop and the life above the floor and what it required to re-enter it with the full weight of her presence. Different angles on the same ocean. She wrote back on the same day. She wrote, "The world is different sizes on different days. The trick, I think, is not to decide the size it is on a hard day is the size it always will be. You went to the coast on a Saturday morning. That is not nothing. That is the size of a Saturday morning, and Saturday mornings accumulate." She posted it before she second-guessed the last sentence, which she thought was possibly too neat and possibly precisely right, and which she decided she would never know the answer to, and which she sent anyway, because the alternative was to keep it, and the keeping of it was not who she was trying to be. Outside, the Brisbane Saturday was doing its unhurried work in the jacaranda-scented air, and the trail run was tomorrow, and Britta was coming on Thursday, and Easter in Cairns was 6 weeks away, and the basil was reaching for the light with the absolute commitment of something that has been given what it needs. And the light was there, and it was ordinary, and it was enough. Nadia did not write to Marcus again after that Saturday. Not from indifference. She thought about him with some regularity across the following months, in the way that you think about a person whose situation has lodged itself in a particular chamber of your attention and continues to occupy that chamber without demanding anything, simply present, the way certain pieces of music are present in the back of your mind on certain days, without your having chosen to put them there. She thought about him on the Tuesday trail runs, when the group moved through the river trails in the early evening, and the light through the fig trees was the specific amber of late afternoon in Queensland, warm and particulate, and she thought, he is somewhere in the hinterland with his reference points, the couple above and the man across the hall, and the coast is 40 minutes from Nambour if he wants it. She thought about him when she planted a 4th herb in the balcony garden bed, a flat-leafed parsley that she had bought on impulse from the nursery on Boundary Road on a Saturday morning, when she had gone in for potting mix, and had come out with potting mix and the parsley and a small terracotta pot whose glaze was the dark red of the hinterland soil, which she had not planned to buy, and which sat on the balcony railing and caught the morning light in a way she found unreasonably satisfying. She thought about him when she drove to Cairns for Easter. Not the drive. She flew, because it was Easter, and Cairns was far, and she had a week with her mother, and she wanted the week to begin as soon as possible rather than after 2 days of driving, and the flight was 2 hours, and she sat at the window with the clouds below, and the coral sea visible as a turquoise intensity to the east, and she thought about the undercroft and the right size and the studio in Nambour and the Saturday on the beach, and she thought about what it takes to move from the space that is survivable to the space that is livable, which is a movement that nobody completes once and holds permanently, but that some people manage more often than others, and which she believed Marcus was beginning to manage. Cairns was everything her mother promised and nothing she had specified. Her mother met her at the airport in the particular way of a parent who has driven to the airport to collect a child they have not seen in 4 months and is managing the management of their own anticipation with the practiced restraint of someone who has decided not to make the arrival an occasion but cannot entirely prevent their face from disagreeing with this decision. She said, "You look different." I moved the couch. Her mother said, "Is that what it is?" She said, "That is part of it." Her mother had not changed the guest room for her arrival, had not put flowers on the dresser or fresh towels in a particular arrangement, or any of the small performances of hosting that Nadia associated with the twice-yearly visits, the performances that had the quality of occasion about them, of something prepared for rather than simply lived in. The room was the room, the ordinary guest room with the ordinary dresser and the reading lamp and the ceiling fan and the louvered windows that admitted the Cairns heat in a managed way, and it smelled of her mother's house rather than of prepared welcome, which was the smell Nadia had grown up in and which she received with the particular depth of reception that belongs to smells associated with safety before you had a word for safety. She put her bag on the floor rather than unpacking it immediately. She lay on the bed. Through the Louvre, the sound of the garden, the specific garden sound of Cairns, which was different from any other city's garden sound because the birds were different, and the density of the growth was different, and the underlying hum of a tropical climate going about its business was a frequency she heard nowhere else. Came in with a warmth, and she lay in it with her eyes open, and she was not counting anything, and she was not waiting for anything, and the ceiling fan moved the warm air over her in the slow rotation of ceiling fans in this climate, which was slower than Brisbane's ceiling fans, slower than the Mooloolaba apartment's ceiling fan, the specific unhurried rotation of a fan that understands the heat it is addressing and has calibrated its response accordingly. She heard her mother in the kitchen. The sounds were the sounds of a person in a kitchen they know completely. The specific sounds of these cupboard doors and this kettle and these drawers. The geography of a kitchen navigated without thought. The sounds of a life being lived rather than a life being performed for an audience. She got up. She went to the kitchen. Her mother was making tea, and she looked up when Nadia came in, and she said, "I did not think you would sleep." Nadia said, "I was not sleeping. I was listening to the garden." Her mother said, "It is loud today." "The fig birds," she said, "I like it." Her mother handed her a mug. They stood in the kitchen together in the afternoon light, which in Cairns was a different quality from Brisbane afternoon light. Denser, more saturated, the light of a latitude closer to the equator that had more of itself to give and gave it without restraint. And they drank their tea, and they did not arrange the conversation into topics. They simply let the conversation be what it was. which was the conversation of two people who have been in each other's lives for 36 years and know each other's rhythms well enough that the conversation can begin anywhere and find its way to the things that matter through the side door rather than the front. Her mother said, "Tell me about the week in Mululaba. You told me some of it on the phone. Tell me the rest." So she told her. She told her about Rue in the corridor and the warmth at the door's edge, and the kettle on the other side, and the drive down the driveway with the Louvre blades open in the mirror, and the 5 days by the ocean, and the phone call to Britta and the moved couch, and Marcus's letter and her reply and his reply about the beach at Mululaba and the ocean being very blue. Her mother listened with the quality of attention that Nadia had been drawing on, without always acknowledging across 36 years. The still, receptive, non-interrupting attention of a person who had decided long ago that listening was a more useful gift than responding, and who had been giving it consistently enough that it had become part of the texture of being in a room with her. When Nadia finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The dog heard it first." Nadia said, "The dog always hears it first." Her mother said, "And you trusted her." She thought about this. She said, "Eventually." Her mother said, "That is usually how it goes." They were quiet together for a moment in the cairn's afternoon, the fig birds loud in the garden and the ceiling fan doing its measured work and the tea warm in their hands. And Nadia thought about trust, the specific question of it. The question of whether you trust the thing that knows before you know, whether you trust the reading of a space before the space has declared itself in terms the rational mind can process. She had trusted Rue. Not immediately, not on arrival when the tale was still and the quality of the stillness registered, but did not yet override the 4.9 rating and the 342 reviews, but eventually, after the sound in the dark and the night in the corridor and the weight shifting below the floor, she had trusted what the dog had already known and had acted on the trust, and the acting on it had been the correct thing, she thought. Trusting the thing that knows before you know is not mysticism. It is simply the honest acknowledgement that your own information processing runs at different speeds in different registers, and that the register that runs fastest is not always the one with the loudest voice. She thought about the 11 months in the register that had been loudest, which was the register of the rational loop, the managed routine, the 4.9 of a life maintained at a safe distance from its own full temperature, and she thought about what it had taken to turn the volume down on that register and hear what the other registers had been saying, which was, "The loop is not the life. The loop is the avoidance of the life, and the life is available, and it is large enough, and you are large enough for it." She thought about Marcus. She thought about the specific courage of a person for whom the world above the floor was genuinely difficult in ways that her own difficulty did not replicate, not as a metaphor, not as a register, but as an actual daily experience of a scale of difficulty she had not lived and could not fully imagine. Going to the coast on a Saturday morning and sitting with the ocean, which was very large, and finding that the size of it was not as frightening as he had expected, and buying a coffee from a van at the car park and drinking it looking at the water. She thought, "The world is perhaps the right size this morning." She thought, "That sentence is one of the best things I have ever read. Not for its polish, not for its construction, for its honesty, for the precision of perhaps, which was not the hedging perhaps of someone who is not committed to what they are saying, but the accurate perhaps of someone who understands that the rightness of the world's size is a measurement taken in the moment and cannot be guaranteed to hold, and who is reporting the measurement as it currently stands with a careful integrity of someone who has learned not to overstate their findings. Perhaps, this morning, 2 words that contained everything that was true and nothing that was false. Her mother said, "Are you all right now?" Nadia said, "I think so." More than I was, her mother said. That is the right answer, she said. It is the honest one. Her mother looked at her with the look she used when she was satisfied by something, and was not going to make a production of the satisfaction. And she refilled Nadia's mug from the teapot, and she said, "The fig birds have been particularly loud this season. I do not know what has gotten into them." And Nadia laughed, and the laugh was the real kind, and her mother smiled at it. And the cairn's afternoon went on around them in all its tropical and unreserved abundance. She stayed the full week. She and her mother went to the market on Saturday morning and bought things they did not need from stalls run by people who were clearly enjoying the selling as much as the commerce. And they had lunch at a table outside a restaurant on the esplanade, with the inlet in front of them, and the Cassuri warning signs on the path behind them. And they talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing, with the ease of two people who have remembered, after a period of lapsing, that they are not just related but genuinely good company for each other, which is a discovery that can be made multiple times across a life, without losing its quality of surprise. On the last evening, Nadia sat in the garden after dinner, while her mother washed the dishes, in the specific garden darkness of a tropical night that was not dark in the conventional sense, but luminous with the combined output of insect and frog and the particular quality of a sky so dense with stars that the darkness between them was the accent rather than the substance. Rue was in Brisbane with Britta, who had been looking after her for the week with the cheerful competence of someone who had been waiting for years to demonstrate that she was excellent with dogs, which she was, and who had sent 3 photographs a day with captions that became progressively more elaborate as the week progressed, the most recent of which had shown Rue on Britta's couch with the caption, "She has been explaining the global geopolitical situation to me for 40 minutes, and I have to say her analysis is compelling." Nadia looked at the photograph again, sitting in the garden. She thought about Rue in the corridor all night, chin on the floor, eyes open, the long watch maintained without instruction or acknowledgement. She thought about what it is to be attended to by something whose attention is entirely without agenda, whose presence is the full extent of its offering, who stays because staying is the thing it knows how to do and has decided is the right thing to do, and does it without drama and without resentment and without the expectation of return. She thought about how rare that was. She thought about how you could spend a great deal of a life looking for it in places that could not provide it in that form, and how you could miss it entirely in the places where it was simply present all along, uncomplicated and warm and with its chin on the floor at the threshold of the laundry, watching the door. She thought, I have been looked after. Not by the building, and not by the undercroft, and not by Marcus in his deliberate and labored handwriting on unlined paper, though each of these had offered her something she had needed, and had not known she was going to receive from that direction. By Rue and Britta, and her mother in the kitchen, refilling the mug without asking, and James on the trail run who ran at her pace without making the accommodation visible, and Constable Webb, who had said, "Take care of yourself," at the end of a professional call, and meant it. She thought, I have been looked after, and I have not been receiving it at full resolution. The loop had been a filter, and the filter had reduced everything to the bandwidth the filter allowed, and the bandwidth had been survivable, and survivable was not the same as full resolution, and she was living now at something closer to full resolution, which was louder and more complex and more demanding and immeasurably more actual. She sat in the garden until her mother came and sat beside her, and they looked at the stars together without speaking, which was its own language, the language of two people who have enough history between them that silence has accumulated its own vocabulary across the years of shared space, and the silence said everything the conversation had not needed to say, which was, I am glad you came, and I am glad you called on a Thursday, and I am glad you are here, and I am glad you are more yourself than you were. She flew home on Sunday. Brisbane received her in the particular way of a city that is not dramatic about arrivals, that simply continues being itself and makes room for you to be yourself within it. The river and the jacaranda and the West End street with the cafe on the corner and the building's lobby and the lift and the flat with the couch in its right position and the garden bed on the balcony with the basil still reaching and the parsley filling out and the thyme and rosemary doing the patient work of herbs that understand their function is to be useful rather than decorative. Britta brought Rue back on Sunday evening. Rue entered the flat with the thoroughness of a border collie who has been away for a week and requires a complete reassessment of the space before she can confirm its status, moving through each room with her nose and her specific intelligence, confirming that the flat was as she had left it, plus the smell of Nadia's returned presence. And when she had confirmed this, she came to where Nadia was standing in the kitchen, and she sat and looked up at her with the expression that had no particular name, but that Nadia had been translating for 6 years, and that translated with reasonable accuracy to, "You are here, and I am here, and this is the status of the situation, and the situation is acceptable." Nadia crouched and held her. Britta said, from the couch where she had installed herself with the ease of someone who has been given a key and has decided that the key represents a general license to make herself comfortable. "I have to tell you something about your dog." Nadia said, "What?" Britta said, "She snores." Nadia said, "I know." Britta said loudly. Said, "I know." Britta said, "Like a much larger dog than she is." Nadia said, "She has strong feelings about sleep." Britta said she expressed them comprehensively. They sat in the flat together for 2 hours with wine and the easy conversation of friends who have moved past the performance of friendship into its actual form, which is less elegant and more comfortable and entirely sustaining. And when Britta left, she paused in the doorway and looked at the flat, and she said, "It is a good flat, this." Nadia looked at the flat. She said, "It is a good flat." She said it and meant it completely, which was a thing she had not been able to say and mean completely since she had been standing in it at the beginning of the 11 months, watching the loop form around her without understanding what it was forming. She understood now, and the understanding was not a conclusion but a beginning. The kind of beginning that does not announce itself with drama but simply presents itself as the next available thing, the next morning's ordinary light coming through the east-facing windows of a flat in West End, where the couch is in the right position, and the garden bed is on the balcony, and the basil is reaching, and the dog is on the couch, and the day is whatever the day contains, and the day is large enough, and so are you. She thought about Marcus one last time before she slept. She thought about him in his studio in Nambour with his reference points, the couple above and the man across the hall and the coast 40 minutes away if he wanted it. And she thought about the ocean being very blue and the coffee from the van at the car park and the world being perhaps the right size this morning. She thought, "I hope the mornings are coming more often," she thought. "I hope the size is holding," she thought. "I will not write again unless he writes first, because the correspondence has been what it needed to be, and the rest of it belongs to him and to the people who are specifically trained to help, and to his mother in the hinterland house, and to the Nambour mornings and the 40-minute drive to the coast on the Saturdays, when the world is the right size for it," she thought. Some things you send into the world and then you let the world have them. The stamp on the envelope, the letter is in the postbox. The rest is not yours. She slept, and Rue was on the end of the bed with her head on Nadia's feet, and the Brisbane night was around them in its warm and ordinary dark, and the garden bed was on the balcony, and the basil was reaching toward the light that would arrive in the morning the way it arrived every morning. Reliable and unhurried and entirely indifferent to whether you were ready for it. Arriving anyway, arriving regardless, arriving because that is what light does. That is what light does. It arrives.